The bandit didn't say a word before he shot Evelyn Mercer's father. He just rode up alongside the wagon, looked at Thomas Mercer the way a man looks at something that's in his way, and pulled the trigger. No warning, no demand for valuables first, no speech about standing and delivering, just the flat crack of a pistol, and then her father was slumping sideways off the wagon bench with a sound she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. The leader, a thick-shouldered man with a scar that pulled the left corner of his mouth into a permanent sneer, watched Thomas fall into the dirt road and didn't even have the decency to look away. He turned to the other two riders and said, calm as discussing the weather, check the wagon, kill the girl if she's trouble. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly the viewer we make these stories for. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. We post new frontier stories every week, and each one runs deeper than the last. While you're at it, press the like button and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. It genuinely matters to us to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Wyoming and to the worst evening of Evelyn Mercer's life. She was 23 years old and crouched behind the rear wheel of a broken wagon in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming territory, listening to two men tear apart everything she and her father owned. The third man, the one with the scar, had stayed on his horse. She could see his boots through the wheel spokes. He wasn't in any hurry. That was the part that frightened her most, more than the sound of crates being thrown, more than the casual cruelty of how quickly it had all happened. The leader wasn't nervous. He wasn't watching the tree line. He wasn't doing any of the things a man does when he's worried about being caught. He had done this before, many times. Evelyn pressed her back flat against the wagon board and forced herself to breathe through her nose. Her father's old hunting rifle was on the bench seat above her. She had heard it slide when the wagon lurched to a stop, and she didn't know if it had fallen to the floor or stayed put. And she was afraid to look because if she moved even slightly, the creak of the wood would tell the man with the scar exactly where she was. Her father was lying 20 feet away in the dirt. She couldn't look at him. Every time she started to, something in the center of her chest locked up, and she couldn't breathe properly, so she stopped trying and focused on the boots. Stay alive, she told herself. That was the only job right now. Stay alive and figure out the rest later. One of the men, she could hear him, broad and sloppy in his movements, was working his way toward the back of the wagon. He'd find her in about 30 seconds if he kept going in the same direction. She made herself move. Slow, deliberate, ignoring the splinter that drove into her palm when she pressed against the wheel for balance. She eased herself along the side of the wagon toward the front, keeping low, keeping quiet, trying to time her movement with the sound of the man throwing things around so the noise covered her own. She was almost to the front wheel when her boot caught the edge of a loose board that had come away from the wagon's frame when they hit the rut that broke the axle. It clattered against the wheel rim. Not loud. Not even close to loud. But in the silence of that stretch of Wyoming road, it was enough. Hey, the broad man's voice, flat, unhurried. She's up front. Evelyn ran. She didn't have a plan. There was no plan available. She just pushed off the wagon wheel and ran for the tree line, which was 40 yards away and might as well have been 40 miles. She heard the leader's horse shift, heard him click his tongue at the animal, heard him begin to move, and she understood with cold clarity that she wasn't going to make the trees. The shot hit the dirt 2 feet to her left. Not a miss, she realized. A warning. He could have killed her from horseback at this range without trying very hard. He was playing. She stopped running because her legs simply refused another step forward with that knowledge sitting in them. She turned around, and there he was, maybe 15 feet away, the scarred man with the gun still raised, looking at her with an expression that had no particular feeling in it at all. "Smart girl," he said. She said nothing. Her mouth had gone completely dry. He was opening his mouth to say something else when the sound of another horse came up the road from the west. Fast. Not the tentative sound of a traveler who'd heard trouble and was deciding whether to investigate. Deliberate, coming straight in. The scarred man's eyes shifted, just for a second. But they shifted. The rider came around the bend at a hard gallop and pulled up short in the road between Evelyn and the wagon, the horse throwing its head and stamping at the sudden stop. The man in the saddle was lean, trail-worn, wearing a coat that had been patched at one elbow and a hat that had seen considerably better decades. He had a rifle across his thighs that he hadn't raised yet. He looked at the scarred man, then at the two on foot, then briefly at Evelyn, just long enough to confirm she was standing. "Evening," he said, as if he'd ridden up on a campfire conversation. The scarred man lowered his pistol slightly, but didn't holster it. "This ain't your business." "Probably not," the writer said. He didn't seem particularly disturbed by this assessment. "You want to tell me what it is, then?" "Road tax," the scarred man said. "Territory charges for use of the road." "That right." The writer glanced at Thomas Mercer's body in the dirt. "He didn't pay?" Something moved across the scarred man's face, not guilt, more like the irritation of a man whose story isn't quite landing. "Resisted." The writer shifted his weight in the saddle. "I'm going to need you to ride on." There was a silence that stretched long enough to have texture to it. The scarred man looked at the two men on foot. Some communication passed between them that Evelyn couldn't read. Then he looked back at the rider on the road. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Done it before," the rider said. "Ride on." Another silence. The scarred man's horse moved restlessly beneath him, and he sat it easily, patient as a man who's waiting for a decision he's already made to simply become obvious. Then, without another word, he turned the horse and nodded at his two companions, and they collected their mounts from where they'd been tied and rode east down the road at a trot that carried them around the next bend and out of sight. The rider watched the bend for a full minute before he moved. Then he stepped down from his horse in one easy motion and walked across the road to where Evelyn stood. Up close, he was older than she'd first thought. Mid-30s, maybe, with a few days of stubble and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that seemed to gather light from somewhere. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that had scabbed over sometime in the last day or two. He stopped about 8 feet away, giving her room. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. He looked over at Thomas Mercer, and for a moment something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Not pity, something quieter than that. "Your father?" The word hit her sideways. She'd been holding herself together through pure animal necessity, and the simple directness of the question nearly undid all of it. She pressed her lips together and nodded. He looked back at her. "I'm Cole Bennett," he said. "I'll bury him proper and get you somewhere safe. That's what I can offer you right now." She stared at him. He waited. "I don't even know you," she finally said. It came out barely above a whisper. "You don't have to," he said. "Yet." His name meant nothing to her in those first minutes. He was simply a stranger who had appeared at the precise moment she needed one, which in her experience was the sort of thing that didn't actually happen. And so she stood with her arms crossed and watched him with the particular wariness of a person who has learned the hard way that gifts rarely come without a price attached. He didn't try to reassure her, didn't fill the silence with explanations about himself or promises about his character. He just went to his saddlebags, took out a short-handled spade, and began looking for a place. He chose a spot 30 feet off the road where a single old cottonwood grew, its roots spreading wide and its branches still holding their last green against the late September sky. He dug without stopping and didn't ask her to help and didn't make a show of not asking. He simply dug. Evelyn stood by her father and waited. She had met Thomas Mercer at the age of 5 when he'd come back from 2 years of trading up north to find that his wife, her mother, had died of fever the previous winter, leaving Evelyn in the care of a neighbor woman who had been kind enough but who had 3 children of her own and not quite enough of anything to go around. Thomas had taken one look at Evelyn and said, "Well, you're coming with me then." That was the entirety of the speech. He wasn't a man who used more words than the situation required. She thought about that now, standing in the dirt road in Wyoming with the sun going down orange and red behind the western ridge line. She thought about how she had never once, in 18 years, heard her father make a promise he didn't keep. She thought about how he'd put his entire life savings into the plan to reach the ranch in Red Willow County, where his old friend Harlan Gibbs had written to say there was work and a future and something resembling a second chance. She thought about how he was never going to see any of it. The grief arrived then, properly and without warning, like a door coming off its hinges. She sat down in the dirt beside him and put her hand over his and cried in the graceless, shaking way of a person who has been holding something enormous for too long. Cole Bennett didn't stop digging. He didn't say anything consoling. He just kept working, and later she would understand that this was exactly the right thing to do, though in the moment it simply felt like being alone, which was almost but not quite the same thing as being alone. He buried Thomas Mercer as the last light went out of the sky. He did it carefully and without rushing, and when it was done, he took off his hat and stood quietly for a moment. Evelyn stood beside him and said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that would have been adequate, and she'd always preferred silence to inadequate things. "You got a name?" he asked, when she stayed quiet a beat too long. "Evelyn Mercer." She paused. "Where are we going?" "Red Willow's the nearest town with a proper hotel. 2 hours ride in the dark, maybe a little more." He looked at the wagon. "Axles cracked through. We can't fix it out here, and I'm not leaving you alone while I go for help. So we leave the wagon, and I take you on my horse." She looked at the wagon. Everything they owned was in it, or had been. The bandits had taken the cash box, though they'd apparently not found the small pouch of coins she'd sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt 2 days out of St. Louis, because her father had told her to, and she'd thought it was excessive caution, and now that excessive caution was all she had. "My bags," she said. "Take what you can carry in front of you." She pulled 2 bags from the wreckage the bandits had made of the wagon's interior. One held clothing, one held the things that couldn't be replaced. Her mother's miniature portrait, the deed to the land they were supposed to homestead, her father's letters from Harlan Gibbs. She looked at a 3rd bag and calculated that she couldn't manage it on horseback and left it. Cole Bennett watched her do this without comment. When she was ready, he helped her up. One brief, businesslike contact, his hand at her elbow, and swung up behind her, and they moved off down the road at a walk that he gradually pressed into a trot. She held herself rigid in the saddle, leaning as far forward as the horse's neck would allow so that she wasn't touching him more than absolutely necessary. He noticed. She knew he noticed because the corner of his mouth moved slightly, though he didn't say anything. "That man," she said, after about 20 minutes of riding. "The one with the scar. You knew him." It wasn't a question. She'd heard something in the exchange that she'd been turning over ever since. A particular quality to the silence between them that didn't belong to strangers. Cole was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Knew of him. Cliff Raines. He's been running this stretch of road for about a year." "And the sheriff doesn't do anything?" "Sheriff in this county has an arrangement with Raines," Cole said. "Or had one last I knew. Arrangements change." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I've got right now." She decided to leave it. She was tired and cold, and the horse's movement was beginning to make her drowsy in a way that frightened her. She didn't want to fall asleep in front of this man, didn't want to be that vulnerable. And so she concentrated on staying awake and watching the road, and not thinking about anything that had happened in the last 4 hours. She failed at the last part. Red Willow appeared as a scatter of lit windows against the dark, and it looked to Evelyn like the least welcoming place she had ever seen, and also the most welcome. Cole brought them to the hotel first, a 2-story building with a covered porch and a sign that needed repainting. He went in ahead of her and came back out in 5 minutes and said the room was paid for 3 nights. "I'll pay you back," Evelyn said immediately. "You don't have to." "I will anyway." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said, in the tone of a man choosing not to argue about something that doesn't much matter. "I'll be in town tomorrow. I can help you figure out how to get word to whoever's expecting you, if you've got someone expecting you." "Harlan Gibbs at the Crosswind Ranch," she said it from memory. "My father's friend. He was arranging work for us." Cole's expression did something complicated for just a fraction of a second. So brief she wasn't sure she'd actually seen it. "You know him?" she asked. "Know of the Crosswind," he said. "Big operation. Good reputation." He touched the brim of his hat. "Sleep, Miss Mercer. Whatever you've got to figure out will still be there in the morning." He turned and walked his horse toward the livery at the end of the street. Evelyn stood on the hotel porch and watched him go and tried to sort out what she felt about any of it, and found that she couldn't. There was too much grief sitting on top of everything else, pressing everything flat. She went inside. She slept badly and dreamed of the sound of that single shot, and woke up before dawn with her heart hammering and lay in the dark for a long time doing the arithmetic of her situation. Assets. The coins sewn into her skirt. Approximately $40. the deed to the homestead land, which was worth nothing without money to develop it. Letters of introduction from her father to Harlan Gibbs, her own two hands and her father's thorough and highly practical education, which had included bookkeeping, animal husbandry, basic carpentry, and the management of accounts, because Thomas Mercer had believed a woman ought to be able to run whatever situation life placed her in. Liabilities. She was alone in Wyoming territory with no family, no horse, and no wagon. The people who had robbed and killed her father were presumably still on that road. She got up, washed her face in the basin, and went downstairs to find breakfast. Cole Bennett was already at a table by the window with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a very early morning conversation with the hotel's owner, a stout woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who had checked Evelyn in the night before with the efficient sympathy of someone who has seen grief often enough to know how to be useful without being sentimental. Cole stood when Evelyn came in. She noted this without commenting on it and sat down across from him and accepted the coffee Mrs. Aldrich poured without being asked. "I looked into the stage schedule," Cole said. "There's one heading out toward Crosswind Country in 4 days. I can arrange your passage and send word ahead to Gibbs that you're coming." "You do that?" "Yes." "Why?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Because there's no reason not to." "That's not much of a reason. It's honest," he said. She studied him. In the daylight, he looked like what he probably was, a working man, capable and self-contained, with a kind of quietness about him that could be either the steadiness of good character or the careful concealment of something else. She hadn't decided which yet. "What do you do?" she asked. "Here in Red Willow." He took a drink of coffee. "I work," he said. "Move around some. Take jobs where I find them." "No permanent position?" "Not at the moment." She filed this away. "Drifter, then, or something like it, or a man who had reasons not to stay in one place." Both were possible. She ate breakfast and they discussed practicalities, what she'd need for the stage journey, whether Mrs. Aldrich knew of any work Evelyn might take for 4 days to earn some of what she'd need. And for an hour or so it felt almost ordinary, the two of them at a table in a quiet hotel dining room, talking about logistics. Then she went upstairs to write the letter to Harlan Gibbs, and Mrs. Aldrich knocked on the door 20 minutes later and handed her a folded piece of paper with the expression of a woman delivering something she's been asked to deliver but has some reservations about. "Found that tacked to the notice board out front," Mrs. Aldrich said. "Figured you ought to see it." She left before Evelyn could ask anything. Evelyn unfolded the paper. It was a wanted poster. The drawing wasn't fine work, these things never were, but it was recognizable enough. The lean face, the set of the jaw, the eyes. Under the drawing, in block letters, Cole Bennett, wanted for armed robbery and murder. Reward, $500. Her hand was very steady, which surprised her. She looked at the poster for a long moment. Then she folded it neatly and put it in her skirt pocket and sat on the edge of the bed and thought. She didn't go back down immediately. She spent about an hour in that room working through it in the methodical way her father had taught her to work through any problem that had numbers attached to it. What do you know for certain? What do you only believe? And what have you assumed without evidence? Certain. Cole Bennett had appeared on that road. He had intervened. He had buried her father. He had paid for this room. Believed. He was kind. He was capable. He had told her his name without hesitation, which was not what a guilty man running from a poster usually did. Assumed that the poster was accurate. She thought about that last category for a long time. When she finally came back downstairs, Cole was still at the same table, reading a 2-day-old newspaper with the patience of a man who has nowhere particular to be. She put the folded poster on the table in front of him and sat down. He looked at it without touching it. Then he looked at her. "How'd you get it?" he asked. "Mrs. Aldrich. Notice board out front." He nodded slowly. "Well?" she said. "Well what? Are you going to tell me it's wrong or not?" He picked up the poster, unfolded it, looked at it with a kind of flat, tired recognition, like a man looking at an old scar. "Most of it," he said. "Which part isn't?" "That's a longer story than you probably want to hear right now." "Try me." He looked up from the poster. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but the look of a man recalibrating his estimate of someone. "Armed robbery. That part's wrong. The man who did it wore my coat because he'd stolen it 2 days before, and the witness who identified me had reason to want me gone. He set the poster down. Murder. One man died. Not by my hand, but I was there. And in the eyes of the law, that makes me close enough to responsible. And the sheriff here? Knows the real story. Enough of it, anyway. Cole leaned back. The sheriff 2 counties over doesn't particularly care about the real story. Evelyn looked at the poster, then at him. Why did you tell me your name? A man with a wanted poster usually doesn't. Because you'd have found out anyway, he said simply, and I'd rather you hear it straight. She thought about this for a while. He waited. I don't know if I believe you, she finally said. That's fair. But I don't know that I disbelieve you either. He said nothing. He didn't press his advantage, which she noticed. A guilty man, she thought, would press it. She picked up the poster and put it back in her pocket. 4 days, she said. Then I'm on the stage. 4 days, he agreed. I was useful over those 4 days in the particular way of someone who knows how to be practically helpful without making it feel like charity. He found out that the mercantile needed someone to help with their accounts for the end of the month, and he mentioned it to Mrs. Aldrich, who mentioned it to Evelyn, and Evelyn went and spoke to the owner and walked out with 3 days of work at fair wages. He checked on the stage arrangements twice and told her when and where, giving her information she would have had to figure out herself and saving her the time. He didn't hover. That was the thing she noticed most. He appeared when he was useful and disappeared when he wasn't, and he never once asked for her gratitude or positioned himself as her protector or said anything that implied she owed him anything. On the 3rd evening, she was sitting on the hotel porch watching the street, and he walked by and she called out without planning to, Bennett. He stopped, turned. Sit for a minute, she said. He came up on the porch and leaned against the railing. Didn't sit. That was a thing about him she'd noticed. He was always positioned to move, to stand up quickly, to go. A man who'd learned to keep his exits available. The man, she said. Cliff Rains. Is he going to come back? Cole was quiet for a moment. Not to you, he said. He doesn't know where you are. But you think he knows who I am? I think he saw your face, Cole said carefully. And I think he's the kind of man who doesn't like loose ends. She absorbed this. You know where I'm going. To the crosswind, yes. Is it safe there? He was quiet for long enough that she looked at him directly. He was looking out at the street. It's a well-run operation, he said. Gibbs is a good man. You'll be looked after. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. Rains doesn't have business out that direction. Not that I know of. You're not going to tell me everything, are you? It wasn't a question. He recognized it as such. I'm telling you what I know for certain, he said, which isn't everything. She decided that this was probably as honest as she was going to get from any person in this territory, and that it would have to do. When you're done in Red Willow, she said, where do you go? He looked out at the street again. Wherever there's work. She didn't ask anything else. He stood there for another few minutes in the companionable silence that had become, over 4 days, their default mode, and then he touched his hat and walked off down the street, and she watched him go. The morning of the 4th day arrived gray and cold, with the first real bite of autumn in the air. Evelyn was packed and standing outside the stage office 20 minutes before the departure time, which was her father's training. He'd believed that being early showed respect for other people's time, and she'd never been able to fully argue herself out of the habit. Cole arrived at 10 minutes before the hour with her stage ticket and the information that her bag had been loaded, and that Mrs. Aldrich had packed something for the journey, and that the driver's name was Frank, and he was reliable. She took the ticket and looked at it. What do I owe you? She asked. For the ticket? $2.40. She counted it out from the coins in her pocket and put it in his hand and felt a small, complicated relief at having repaid that much. The room, she said. Consider it settled. I don't, Miss Mercer. His voice was quiet, not harsh. Consider it settled. She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily. This was, she had learned over 4 days, what he did when he'd made a decision. He became completely still and waited for you to arrive at the same conclusion. All right, she said. The stage was loading. Other passengers, a merchant couple from the east, an older man with a surveyor's bag, a young woman who appeared to be traveling alone and who looked nearly as wary as Evelyn felt, were climbing aboard. Bennett, Evelyn said, He looked at her. She almost didn't say it. The sensible thing was to thank him and get on the stage and put all of this behind her. She was going somewhere safe, somewhere with work and a future, and the memory of what her father had planned. Staying connected to a man with a wanted poster was not the sensible thing. "If you're ever out crosswind direction," she said, "look for Harlan Gibbs's operation." He said nothing for a moment. Then something very brief and not quite a smile moved across his face. "I'll bear that in mind." She got on the stage. She didn't look back out the window when they pulled away. She made herself look forward, at the road ahead, at the country opening up in front of her. Gray sky, yellow grass, the dark line of the mountains still capped with snow that had come early this year. She thought about her father, and about the cottonwood tree, and about a man who'd appeared at the exact moment she needed one and had never once asked her to be grateful for it. She thought about the wanted poster, still folded in her pocket. She thought about his words, the first ones he'd said to her, standing in the road with 3 men and a dead body and the entire wilderness around them. "You don't have to, yet." She pulled her coat tighter and watched Wyoming go by outside the window, and she told herself that she was done with Cole Bennett and that chapter was closed. She almost believed it. The Crosswind Ranch didn't look like salvation. It looked like work. That was Evelyn's first thought when the stage crested the last rise and the valley opened up below. A sprawling operation of barns and outbuildings and fenced pasture that stretched further than she could take in at one glance, with a main house that was large without being grand, and a bunkhouse running long and low behind it. Cattle dotted the far pasture in numbers she couldn't easily count. Everything about it said purpose rather than comfort, which suited her fine. She hadn't come here for comfort. Harlan Gibbs met the stage himself, which she hadn't expected. He was a big man gone soft in the middle, with a white mustache and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 40 years reading weather off a horizon. He'd shaken her hand with both of his and said, "Thomas wrote me about you, said you could run a set of books better than any man he'd hired." He'd paused. "I'm sorry about Thomas. I was a good man, and I'll miss him the rest of my life." She'd thanked him and not cried, which she considered a personal achievement. He'd shown her to a small room at the back of the main house, not a servant's room, but not a guest room either, something in between, practical and clean, and told her she'd be working with his bookkeeper, an older man named Aldous Pratt, who was losing his eyesight and needed someone to take over by spring at the latest. The pay was fair, the work was real, she had a place. That should have been enough, and for the first 3 weeks it almost was. She threw herself into the ledgers with a focus that left her little time to think about anything else. Aldous Pratt was a meticulous man who had developed over 30 years of record-keeping, a system of notation that was entirely his own and bore only approximate resemblance to any standard accounting method. Learning it was like learning a second language from a teacher who couldn't quite remember why he'd made the grammatical choices he had. Evelyn found she loved it. The puzzle of it kept her mind occupied during the hours when, without something to occupy it, her mind went to bad places. The ranch hands were polite and kept their distance, which was the arrangement she preferred. Mrs. Tully, who ran the house, was a spare, efficient woman from Minnesota who communicated primarily through the placement of food and the quality of her silences, and Evelyn respected her enormously. Harlan Gibbs checked in every few days, asked practical questions about the books, and occasionally said something about Thomas that was so precise and so affectionate that Evelyn had to excuse herself and go wash her face before she could continue the conversation. She didn't resent him for it. He just missed her father, and grief has its own timeline. She was, by any objective measure, fine. She kept the wanted poster in the small tin box where she kept her mother's miniature portrait and the deed to the homestead land. She hadn't looked at it in 2 weeks. She told herself this was because she'd made her decision about Cole Bennett and there was nothing further to think through. She was mostly able to believe this. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 4 days after she'd reached the Crosswind. It was from Mrs. Aldrich in Red Willow, and it was brief. The older woman wasn't given to lengthy correspondence, but its content was not brief in its implications. Mrs. Aldrich wrote that she'd heard from a man passing through that Cliff Raines and his outfit had been asking questions in Red Willow about the woman who'd been at the hotel. That the man passing through had thought Evelyn ought to know. That Mrs. Aldrich personally felt this was none of her business, but had decided to write anyway on the grounds that Thomas Mercer had seemed like a decent man, and his daughter deserved better than to be caught unawares. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and sat for a while at Aldous Pratt's desk, looking at a column of numbers without seeing them. She thought about what Cole had told her on the porch. Raines doesn't have business out that direction. Not that I know of. Not that I know of. She thought about going to Harlan Gibbs. He had a right to know if there was trouble potentially heading toward his operation. But she also thought about what it would mean, the questions it would raise about her, about who she'd talked to in Red Willow, and what she knew and how she knew it. She wasn't ready for those questions yet. She put the letter in the tin box and went back to the ledgers and didn't sleep well for the next 4 nights. The harvest celebration was Harlan Gibbs's annual tradition, and the whole valley seemed to know about it. By the afternoon of the 3rd Saturday in October, there were wagons and horses tied along every fence rail, and the yard between the main house and the bunkhouse had been cleared and strung with lanterns, and Mrs. Tully and 3 women from neighboring operations had been cooking since before dawn. Harlan moved through the gathering with the ease of a man in his own element, shaking hands and clapping shoulders, and laughing at things that weren't necessarily that funny, but which he found amusing anyway. Evelyn helped where she was useful, and stayed near the edges of things where she wasn't. She'd never been particularly good at parties. Her father had called it a character flaw, and she'd called it good judgment, and they'd argued about it pleasantly for years. She accepted a cup of cider from a cowhand who offered it with a grin and found a spot near the corner of the barn where she could watch the gathering without being in the middle of it. She was standing there, thinking about nothing in particular, when she saw him. Cole Bennett was across the yard, talking to 2 of the ranch hands she recognized from the cattle pens. He was dressed the same way she'd seen him dressed every day in Red Willow. Working clothes, worn but clean, the coat with the patched elbow. He was listening to something one of the hands was saying and nodding, and there was something about the way the other men were standing relative to him, the slight orientation of their bodies toward him, the way they deferred to his responses, that told her, even before she could process the full picture, that he was not a guest here. He belonged here. She stood very still. He turned his head, the way people do when they feel attention on them, and found her immediately across the crowded yard. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted in it. A slight tension, like a man who has been waiting for something and has now confirmed that it's arrived. He said something brief to the 2 hands and came across the yard toward her. She considered, for about 3 seconds, moving away. She could go back inside the house and claim she needed something and avoid this entirely. She stayed where she was. "Miss Mercer," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Mr. Bennett." She kept her voice level. "You're going to explain yourself." "I was hoping to, yes." She looked at him steadily. "Start." He looked briefly at the people nearest to them, then back at her. "Could we walk some?" She set her cider cup on the fence rail and followed him around the corner of the barn, out of the noise and the lantern light, into the quieter dark of the side yard. He stopped and turned to face her. "I'm the foreman here," he said. "Have been for 2 years." She let that land before she responded. "When I mentioned the crosswind in Red Willow, you knew exactly what it was. You knew you worked here." "Yes?" "You didn't say so." "No." She crossed her arms. "Why not?" He looked at the ground for a moment. Not evasion, more like a man choosing the most accurate words from a set that none of them quite fit. "Because I didn't know how you'd take it. I just helped you out of a bad situation and told you I'd get you to safety, and then you found a wanted poster with my name on it. If I'd also said, 'By the way, I work at the ranch you're heading to,'" he stopped, "it would have looked like I'd arranged it somehow, or that I had reasons for knowing where you were going that weren't what I said they were." She thought about this. The logic of it was not, in fact, unreasonable. She found this irritating. "So you let me arrive here without warning me. I told myself you were sharp enough to handle it when the time came." "That's a convenient thing to tell yourself." "It was also true," he said quietly. She looked at him. The evening light from the lanterns on the far side of the barn caught the side of his face, and she could see that he was tired, not from the day, but from something that had been going on longer than the day. The tiredness that lives around the eyes and doesn't go away with sleep. "The wanted poster," she said. "You told me most of it was wrong. What's the part you didn't tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. "The man who died. His name was Roy Casper. He was my employer's son, and he'd been skimming money from the operation for about 2 years, and I was the one who found out about it. He said this flatly, without drama. He came at me when I confronted him. There was a fight. He went over a fence rail, hit his head, and he didn't get up. He paused. His father had the money and the connections to make sure the story that reached the law was the story that served him best. And the robbery? Roy's coat was similar to mine. Wrong man, wrong time. He shrugged slightly. The witness was the employer's foreman, and he'd hated me since I took a job he thought should have been his. Evelyn said nothing. She was sorting through it. What was verifiable, what she was taking on faith, what the gaps were. Mr. Gibbs knows this? She asked. He knows enough of it. Harlan doesn't hire men without doing his own checking. And the law? The 2 counties over? Still out there, Cole said. Nothing's been resolved. That's not a thing that resolves quickly when money's involved in keeping it unresolved. She looked at him for a long time. The noise of the celebration carried around the corner of the barn. Fiddle music, laughter, the particular high sound of someone telling a story that was getting funnier as it went. Why did you intervene on that road? She asked. The real reason. I told you the real reason. No reason not to. That's not a reason. He looked at her steadily. Rains killed a woman 3 months ago, on that same stretch of road. She was traveling alone and she refused to hand over her money, and he shot her the same way he shot your father, some. One shot, no hesitation, and rode on. He paused. I couldn't prove it. I told the sheriff here, and the sheriff wasn't interested. So when I came around that bend and saw his horse, I wasn't going to ride past. She felt the air go out of her chest slightly. She'd asked for the real reason, and he'd given it, and it was not a simple one. It was the reason of a man carrying something heavy who'd finally found somewhere to put part of it down. The woman, she said. Did you know her? No, he said. I just know she died alone on a road in the middle of nowhere, and nobody did anything about it. She was quiet for a while. The fiddle on the other side of the barn changed to a different tune, slower and lower. I got a letter, she said, from Mrs. Aldrich in Red Willow. She says Rains has been asking about me. Cole went very still. I thought you should know, Evelyn said, since you seem to know more about this situation than most people. When did you get the letter? Tuesday. He turned that over. 4 days ago. He looked past her toward the road, though there was nothing to see in the dark. He's not stupid, Rains. Asking questions is him being careful before he moves. He's figuring out where you went before he does anything. Is he likely to do anything? I don't know, Cole said, and she appreciated that he didn't soften it. He doesn't like witnesses, but he also doesn't usually go after people unless there's profit in it, and coming after you here means coming onto Harlan Gibbs's operation, and Rains isn't that bold. Usually, she said. Usually, he agreed. She nodded slowly. I'm going to tell Mr. Gibbs. I'd do the same. She looked at him one more time. He looked back, not asking her for anything, not explaining himself any further, just standing there in the dark on the side of the barn while fiddle music played around the corner. You could have written to me, she said, when I was in Red Willow. You could have told me before I arrived here. I thought about it. What stopped you? He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me, he said finally. She didn't have an answer for that, partly because it was honest and partly because she wasn't sure he was wrong. She went back around the corner of the barn to the celebration, and he followed a few minutes later, and they spent the rest of the evening on opposite sides of the yard, which was the reasonable and sensible arrangement. She was aware of where he was for most of the night anyway. She found this irritating and unsurprising in approximately equal measure. She told Harlan Gibbs the next morning. She sat in his office, a room that smelled of leather and old tobacco and the particular musty warmth of papers that had accumulated over decades. And she told him about the road and her father and Cliff Rains and the letter from Mrs. Aldrich. And she did it in order, without embellishment, the way her father had taught her to report a problem. Give the facts first, save the interpretation for after. Gibbs listened with his elbows on the desk and his fingers laced together and his expression doing very little. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Cole Bennett was on that road, he said, not a question. Yes. He tell you he worked here? Not until last night. Gibbs made a sound that wasn't quite a grunt. That's Cole. He He doesn't say things until he's sure the time's right for them, and sometimes his sense of timing is worse than he thinks. He leaned back. Rains. I know the name. He's been a problem in this county for a while, but he's smart enough to stay just outside of where I can reach him. Cole said he doesn't usually come onto well-established operations. Cole's right, usually. Gibbs looked at her. You said usually just now, too. I did, he nodded. Smart. He stood up, which seemed to indicate the meeting was progressing to its action phase. I'll get word out, and I'll put an extra man on the western approach for the next few weeks. I'm sorry to bring trouble. You didn't bring trouble, Miss Mercer. Trouble found you on a road, same as it finds anyone. He moved toward the door, then paused. Your father wrote me about you when he was planning the trip. Said you were stubborn and practical and occasionally infuriating in your insistence on doing things properly. He smiled briefly and with genuine warmth. So far, he's been exactly right. She left the office feeling something she couldn't quite name. Not relief, not safety, exactly, but something closer to the feeling of ground under her feet after a long time walking on ice. October settled into the ranch in layers. First the hard frosts at night, then the daytime cold that didn't fully release even at noon, then the first week of November that arrived with a 3-day wind that drove everyone indoors when they didn't absolutely need to be out. Evelyn learned the rhythm of the place. She was at Aldous Pratt's desk every morning by 7, and she'd come to understand his notation system well enough now that she was beginning to spot its inefficiencies. Places where 2 entries were doing the work of 1, places where categories that should have been separated had been combined for reasons that made sense in 1871, but not in 1879. She brought these observations to Aldous carefully, framing them as questions rather than corrections, and he would look at what she was pointing to and make a sound like a man who's been told something he already knew but hadn't felt like addressing and say, well, go ahead and fix it then. She fixed things. Slowly, methodically, in a way that didn't break what was working while improving what wasn't. Cole Bennett ran the ranch hands with a similar approach, she noticed. And she noticed more than she'd intended to, because the ranch was not large enough for 2 people to avoid each other entirely when one of them was the foreman and the other was working in the main house. He came through the office every few days to look at the supply orders with Aldous, and she would be at her desk, and they had developed a way of occupying the same room that involved speaking directly about relevant matters and not particularly about anything else. We're going to need another 50 pounds of salt for the curing, he'd say to Aldous, not looking at her. It's already ordered, she'd say, also not looking up from her work. Arrives Thursday. A beat of silence. Good, he'd say. It was objectively a ridiculous way for 2 adults to behave. She knew this. She also didn't change it, and neither did he. The ranch hands had opinions about this that they kept mostly to themselves, though not entirely. A young hand named Will, who was 22 and had not yet learned which thoughts were better kept internal, said at supper one evening, to the table generally, not quite to Evelyn specifically. Cole seems like he's in a better mood when you're around. There was a silence. That's because she keeps the accounts straight, said an older hand named Dolan, with the expression of a man throwing a rope to someone who'd wandered off a cliff. Which means he's not getting yelled at about the salt order. Right, said Will, who had learned something. Evelyn took a drink of coffee and did not dignify any of it with a response, which the older hand seemed to appreciate. The first real test came in the second week of November. A man showed up at the Crosswinds Western Gate on a Wednesday afternoon. Not a ranch hand, not a buyer, not any of the faces that came and went with the regular business of a large operation. He was riding a gray horse and asking for work, which was plausible enough at face value. What was less plausible was that he'd come from the west, which was empty country for 30 miles, rather than from the road to the south, where any drifting cowhand looking for work would naturally come from. One of the hands turned him away politely and came to find Cole, who came to find Evelyn, which was not a sequence of events she'd been expecting. The description, Cole said, standing in the office doorway. Aldous had gone home for the day. Tall, thin, riding a gray came from the west. You recognize that? She thought. Raines's men. One of them was tall and thin. I didn't see the horse clearly. Cole nodded. He didn't seem particularly alarmed, which she took as a signal that this was manageable rather than catastrophic, though she also knew by now that his affect was not always a reliable indicator of his actual assessment. Tell me everything you remember about the man with the scar, he said. Rains, everything. What he said, how he moved, where his eyes went. She told him. She was good at this. She'd always noticed things, the small, precise details that most people filtered out, and she laid them out in order. Cole listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he stood for a moment in the doorway, turning it all over. He sent one man to look, he said. That's still him being careful. He wants to confirm you're here before he decides what to do about it. And now he knows I'm here. Probably. He straightened up. I'm going to talk to Harlan. We need to think about what options look like if Rains decides to move. What options are there? He looked at her. A few. None of them entirely comfortable. He paused. You're not going to like the one that works best. Tell me anyway. Not yet, he said. Let me talk to Harlan first. She opened her mouth. I'm not managing you, he said, with a directness that was not unkind. I just need to know what Harlan's willing to do before I tell you what he can offer. That's a practical sequencing, not a decision being made over your head. She closed her mouth. The logic of it was, again, not unreasonable. She found herself increasingly annoyed by how frequently that was the case. He left. She sat at the desk for a while after, looking at the supply ledger without seeing it, thinking about a man with a scar who moved through the territory like someone who'd learned there were no real consequences for what he did, and had organized his life around that belief. She thought about the woman who'd died on that road 3 months before Cole found her. No name. No one who'd known to do anything about it. She thought about what Cole had said. I just know she died alone on a road in the middle of nowhere, and nobody did anything about it. She understood, sitting at that desk, that she had a choice about whether she was going to be that woman or whether she was going to be something else. And she understood with the same clarity that being something else was going to require her to trust people she wasn't entirely sure of yet and take action she couldn't fully control the outcome of. Thomas Mercer had raised her to be practical. She opened the account ledger and went back to work, because there was nothing useful to do until Cole came back from talking to Harlan, and sitting with her fear accomplished nothing. But the fear sat with her anyway, quiet and patient, the way Cliff Rains's man had probably sat on that gray horse outside the western gate, waiting to confirm what he'd come to confirm. Cole came back an hour later. He stood in the doorway again. She noticed he always stood in doorways rather than coming fully into a room unless he was specifically invited, a habit she suspected had to do with the years of being someone who needed to be ready to leave quickly. And he told her what Harlan had said. There's a land office in Mill Haven, he said, 40 miles east. The deputy territorial marshal is based there. Harlan knows him personally. They've done business, and Harlan's helped him out on a few things over the years. And Harlan thinks if you go to Mill Haven and make a formal statement about what Rains did on that road, eyewitness account, sworn and recorded, it changes the situation. Right now, Rains is operating in a county where the sheriff doesn't care. A territorial marshal is different. She thought about this. Would they act on it? Harlan thinks so. The marshal's been building a case on Rains for about 2 years. He needs a witness who was there for a specific incident, not just general knowledge that Rains operates badly. I'd have to go to Millhaven. Yes. She looked at him. You're going to offer to take me. Something moved across his face. Harlan was going to suggest it. You're his responsibility while you're here, and he doesn't want to send you 40 miles on a road with Rains's man having just confirmed where you are. And if I go to the marshal, she said slowly, and make a formal statement, Rains has a reason to move against me before I can get there. That's the uncomfortable part, Cole said. Yes. She was quiet. You don't have to do it, he said. Harlan's not going to push you, and I'm not going to push you. You can stay here, stay careful, hope Rains decides you're not worth the trouble. And the woman who died on that road? He said nothing. He didn't have to. Evelyn closed the account ledger and placed her pen in its holder with the precise, deliberate motion of a person making a decision. When do we leave? She asked. He looked at her for a moment with that same expression she'd first seen in Red Willow, the one that reassessed something without announcing the reassessment. Day after tomorrow, he said. Harlan wants to send 2 other hands with us, and I want to take the south road through Carver's Creek rather than the main western route. Longer? Safer. She nodded. All right. He pushed off the door frame to leave. Bennett, she said. He stopped. She looked at the closed ledger on the desk. I know you didn't arrange any of this, she said. I want you to know I know that. He turned slightly. What do you mean? The road, the crosswind, any of it. I know you didn't engineer it to put yourself in a position where I'd have to depend on you. She looked up at him. I'm not sure I believed that completely when I was in Red Willow. I want you to know I believe it now. He was quiet for a moment. The lantern in the hallway behind him cast his face into partial shadow. It matters that you said that, he said finally, quietly, without elaboration. Then he left, and Evelyn sat alone in the office with the account ledger and the evening light going thin through the window, and she thought about 40 miles of Wyoming road and a man with a scar who didn't like loose ends. She'd stopped running the day Cole Bennett had ridden around that bend. She hadn't fully registered it until right now. She wasn't going to start again. They left before dawn, which was Cole's idea, and a good one. The south road through Carver's Creek added nearly 3 hours to the journey, which meant they'd arrive in Millhaven well after noon and need to stay the night before riding back. Harlan had arranged a letter of introduction to the deputy marshal, a man named Aldridge, and had pressed it into Evelyn's hand the previous evening with the quiet urgency of someone who understood that formal letters matter in formal proceedings, and that her word alone, however truthful, would land differently without one. Cole had selected the 2 hands who'd ride with them, Dolan, the older man who'd saved young Will from his own mouth at supper, and a quiet Texan named Breeze who carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had done difficult things and had no need to discuss them. Evelyn had seen Breeze around the ranch for weeks without hearing him say more than a dozen words total. She found his presence reassuring in a way she didn't try to explain. The first hour of riding was cold and dark, and nobody talked much. Evelyn's horse, a steady brown mare named Cora that Harlan had assigned her during her second week at the Crosswind, moved without complaint through the pre-dawn chill, and Evelyn focused on the road and her own breathing and the discipline of not looking over her shoulder every 30 seconds. She looked over her shoulder approximately every 60 seconds. She considered this an improvement. Around the first bend past the Carver's Creek crossing, when the sky had gone from black to the particular dark blue that precedes actual light, Cole pulled his horse alongside hers. You sleep last night? He asked. Some. He rode with his reins loose, watching the road ahead the way a man does when he's tracking several things at once. Aldridge is a straight dealer. He'll take your statement seriously. You know him? Worked a drive that passed through Millhaven 2 years back. Talked to him some. He paused. He's not going to make it easy. He'll want details, and he'll push on the ones he thinks are soft, and he won't apologize for it. Good, Evelyn said. He glanced at her. If he's easy about it, she said, the statement isn't worth anything. A statement that holds up under hard questioning is the one that matters. Cole looked back at the road. Your father teach you that? My father taught me that anything worth doing is worth doing correctly, and that correctly usually means harder than you first thought. She adjusted her grip on the reins. He had a lot of variations on that theme. Cole was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was worth knowing. He was, she said. And then, because the morning was early and she was tired and the guard she usually kept was operating at reduced capacity. He would have liked you, I think. He had a thing for people who say only what they mean. Said most people use words to hide in, not to communicate with. She heard what she'd said approximately 2 seconds after she'd said it. She didn't take it back. Taking it back would have been more awkward than leaving it. Cole rode quietly beside her for a moment. That might be the most straightforwardly kind thing you've said to me, he said finally. Don't read too much into it. It's early, and I haven't had coffee. She heard the slight shift in his breathing that had come to understand, over the weeks at the Crosswind, was what passed for a laugh with Cole Bennett. They rode on. Long. Carver's Creek was a small settlement rather than a real town. A trading post, a blacksmith, a handful of houses clustered around the creek crossing, as if they'd rolled there by accident and decided to stay. They stopped long enough to water the horses, and for Dolan to conduct what appeared to be a complicated negotiation with the trading post owner over the price of dried beef that ended with both men looking equally unhappy, which Dolan explained afterward was the definition of a fair deal. Cole had gone ahead to the crossing while the horses drank and stood for a while looking at both approaches to the bridge. Evelyn watched him do this. He had his back to her, and he was still in the way that she'd come to recognize as actual assessment rather than simple patience. He was reading something in the landscape, the road, the angles. When he came back, his expression was the same as always, which she'd learned did not necessarily mean nothing was wrong. "There's a rider's marks coming up from the South Pasture Trail," he said quietly, to her specifically, not to Dolan or Breeze. "Fresh, last 2 hours." "The South Pasture Trail goes where?" "Nowhere useful, if you're heading somewhere legitimate. It's ranch access mostly. Comes around the long way from the western country." She understood what he wasn't saying. "Someone came around the long way." "Could be nothing. Could be a rancher cutting through." "But," he met her eyes, "but we're going to ride a little faster from here." They did. The rider appeared on a ridge to their left about 40 minutes out of Carver's Creek. Just one man, sitting a horse on the high ground, not moving. Far enough away that Evelyn couldn't make out features, only the silhouette, man and horse, against a November sky that had gone the color of old pewter. Dolan saw him at the same time she did and said something low to Breeze that she didn't catch. "Keep riding," Cole said. Not loud, not sharp, just the flat instruction of someone who has thought through the available options and knows which one applies. "He's just watching," Evelyn said. "For now." "Is that Rains?" "Wrong build," Cole said. "One of his men." He didn't look at the ridge as he spoke, which she found more unsettling than if he had. A man who doesn't look at a threat has made a calculation about what looking will cost him. "He's counting us, seeing who made the trip, and reporting back." "Yes." She kept her eyes on the road and resisted the urge to look at the ridge again. After about 3 minutes of riding, she looked anyway. The silhouette was gone. "He left," she said. "He confirmed what he needed to." Cole's horse moved at the same easy pace. Nothing about him suggested alarm, and she understood this was deliberate. He was not going to push the horses into a run on an open road where a run would tell any watcher watching exactly how concerned they were, and where tired horses were a problem later, regardless. "We keep going, same pace. We get to Millhaven, and we talk to Aldridge, and we do what we came to do. And Rains knows we're doing it. He might guess. He doesn't know for certain why we're going to Millhaven." "He's not stupid," she said. "You said so yourself." "No," Cole agreed, "he's not." She rode with that for a while. The road dropped down into a shallow valley, and the ridge disappeared behind them, and the wind picked up from the north carrying the first serious suggestion of real winter. And she thought about a man with a scar who'd watched her father die with no more feeling than he'd watch a coin toss. She thought about the woman on the road who had no name. She thought, "I'm going to say every word I remember, every detail, every exact thing he did and said, and how he moved. I'm going to give Aldridge something he can use, and it is going to hold up, because I am going to make sure it does." "Tell me what Aldridge will ask," she said to Cole. He looked at her. "So I can think through my answers on the ride," she said. "Tell me the hardest questions he'll push on. Let me practice the soft spots before we get there." He thought for a moment. Then he started talking, and she listened, and the miles went by. Deputy Territorial Marshal Elias Aldridge was a small man in his 50s with a neat gray beard and the kind of posture that suggested either military background or a mother who'd been serious about it. His office in Millhaven was in the back of the land registry building, and it smelled of dust and old paper, and the particular bureaucratic permanence of a place where important things got written down. He looked at Harlan Gibbs's letter, then at Evelyn, then at Cole, with the brief recognition of a man placing a face he's encountered before, then back at Evelyn. "Sit down, Miss Mercer," he said. Cole and Dolan and Breeze waited in the outer office. Evelyn sat across from Aldridge and folded her hands in her lap and waited. He asked her to start from the beginning, and she did. She gave him the road, the wagon, the sequence, the leader approaching, the shot, the single flat crack of it, the 2 men on foot, the way the leader had said, "Kill the girl if she's trouble with the casualness of a man ordering breakfast." Aldridge listened without expression and without writing anything down yet, which told her he was still in his first pass assessment, deciding whether she was reliable before he committed her words to paper. When she finished the initial account, he leaned forward. "You said the leader gave the order to the other 2 men. What exactly were his words?" She told him. "Exactly." "And his voice? Loud? Quiet? Quiet? Quiet. He didn't need to be loud. They were paying attention to him." Which direction were the other two men standing when he gave the order? She placed them. She was good at this. She'd always had the kind of memory that held spatial details, the arrangement of people in a room, the angles. He wrote that down. She took this as a positive sign. The questioning went on for the better part of 2 hours. He pushed on the light conditions. She'd told him it was late afternoon, pushing toward evening, and he wanted to know precisely what she could and couldn't see at that distance and in that light. He pushed on the timing, how long between the rider's approach and the shot. He pushed on her position behind the wheel when she heard the leader speak, establishing what she could verify by sight versus what she'd heard only. Every time he pushed, she answered with exactly what she knew and nothing she didn't. When she wasn't certain, she said so. When she was, she didn't hedge it. At one point he said, "You seem very certain about a number of details from a situation that must have been extremely frightening." "I was frightened," she said. "I was also paying very close attention because the details felt like the difference between surviving and not." He looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something down. When it was finally done, the formal statement drafted, read back to her, corrected on 2 minor points, and signed. Aldridge sat back and looked at the papers. "This is the clearest eyewitness account of Raines's direct involvement in a killing that I have," he said. "I want to be accurate about that so you understand the weight of what you've done today. Does it give you what you need?" "It gives me more than I had this morning," he said carefully. "Whether it's enough to move on depends on factors that aren't entirely in my control. The territorial circuit judge has to sign the warrant. That takes time. Raines will not be arrested tomorrow." She'd expected this. "How long?" "Weeks, possibly longer." He paused. "I want to be direct with you. If Raines hears that a formal statement has been made, and he likely will hear because men like Raines have arrangements with people who hear things, he may decide to act before the warrant moves through." "We believe he's already aware we came to Millhaven," Evelyn said. "Someone was watching the road." Aldridge's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Bennett's with you?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "All right, I'll write to Harlan Gibbs tonight. I want the Crosswind informed, and I want you to understand that you're safer there than most places. Gibbs has enough reputation and enough men that Raines would think carefully before bringing trouble directly to his gate." He paused. "Cole Bennett being there doesn't hurt either." She filed this observation away without commenting on it. She came out of the office into the late afternoon gray of the outer room, where Cole was sitting in one of the chairs with his hat on his knee and his eyes on the door, which was where his eyes had been, she suspected, for the better part of 2 hours. He stood, read her face. "It went well," she said. "He'll write to Harlan tonight." Something in Cole's posture settled by a fraction. Good. Dolan and Breeze were outside with the horses, and Cole held the door for her, and they went out into the cold. The town of Millhaven was larger than Red Willow and more permanent feeling. Brick buildings, a proper bank, 2 hotels. Cole had already found them rooms at the nearer hotel and arranged supper, which was practical, and she appreciated it without saying so specifically, because she was tired and grateful in a way that had gotten harder to keep entirely behind her usual reserve. At supper in the hotel's dining room, the 4 of them, with Dolan doing most of the talking in the comfortable way of a man who fills silences socially and doesn't expect or need much response. Cole was quieter than usual, which she hadn't thought was possible. She caught him looking at the door twice. After Dolan and Breeze had gone upstairs, she sat across from Cole with what remained of the coffee and said, "What are you thinking about?" He turned the cup in his hands. "The man on the ridge. You think he'll report back tonight? If he rode fast from Carver's Creek, he's had all day." Cole set the cup down. "Raines will know by now that you went to Millhaven with Harlan Gibbs's foreman. And he'll guess why." "Yes." She looked at the table. "Does that change the ride back tomorrow?" "We're not taking the south road back," he said. "We'll go up through Harker's Pass. Longer, higher, colder, but it comes out near the Crosswind's north pasture, and it's not a route anyone would anticipate." "You've been planning this since the ridge." "Since before the ridge," he said. "Since we left this morning." She looked at him. "You planned for the possibility that he'd have someone watching the road before we left the Crosswind?" "I planned for several possibilities before I go to sleep each night," he said simply. Habit. She thought about what kind of years would produce that habit in a person, and she thought she had some sense of the answer. The case against you, she said. The robbery and the murder. You said it hadn't been resolved. Is there anything that could resolve it? He was quiet for a moment. She had learned by now to read the quality of his silences. This one wasn't evasion. It was the particular quiet of a man who has thought about something so many times that the thinking itself has become exhausting. The man who set me up, Hargrove, the employer, has a partner in the county land office. The partner has the original accounts that I found, the ones that show Roy Casper was skimming. If those accounts ever came to light, the story changes. He paused. But Hargrove's had 2 years to bury them, and a man with money and a reason buries things thoroughly. Do you know where the accounts are? I have a strong guess. Have you tried to get them? He looked at her. Not yet. Why not? He was quiet again, different quality this time. Because doing it wrong means I spend the rest of my life running instead of just the inconvenience I'm managing now. He paused. And because until recently, there wasn't a compelling reason to hurry. She held his gaze for a moment. The dining room was nearly empty now, the last other table having cleared out while they were talking, and the quiet made the space between them feel smaller than the actual distance. Recently, she said. Yes, he said. She picked up her coffee cup and looked at it and put it down. That's a lot of weight to carry on the basis of a few weeks' acquaintance, she said carefully. It is, he agreed. I haven't given you any reason to think. No, he said. You haven't. That's not what I said. She thought about that. He was right, technically. He hadn't said she'd given him a reason. He'd said there was a compelling reason to hurry. These were not the same statement, and she found, sitting in a hotel dining room in Mill Haven with cold coffee and a hard ride ahead of her tomorrow, that she was too tired to sort out exactly what the difference meant. Get some sleep, she said, and pushed back from the table. You too, he said. She went upstairs and lay in the dark, and thought about the road and Aldridge's office, and the man on the ridge, and a set of buried accounts in a county land office somewhere. And she fell asleep faster than she'd expected because her body had finally run out of the fuel that worry runs on. Harker's Pass was exactly as promised, longer, higher, and considerably colder. The trail climbed through stands of aspen that had dropped their leaves weeks ago, leaving the white trunks bare and stark against the gray sky, and then above the tree line into open country where the wind had opinions and expressed them constantly. Nobody talked much. The trail required attention, and the cold discouraged conversation. They were 2/3 of the way through the pass when Breeze, who had been riding rear, pulled up and whistled once, a short, low sound that brought all of them to a stop without a word being exchanged. Cole turned his horse and looked back, and Breeze pointed to the left toward the eastern slope, and Cole sat very still for a moment looking at whatever Breeze had seen. Evelyn looked. She couldn't see anything, just rock and the thin scrub that survived at this altitude and the gray sky. Then she saw the movement. A horse, picking its way along the eastern slope maybe 200 yards away, moving parallel to them. Then another one. She couldn't see riders clearly. They were keeping low, using the scrub and the rock. But the horses were visible if you knew to look. 2, Breeze said. One word. Cole nodded. He looked at the trail ahead. Another half-mile of exposed ridge before they dropped down into the protected country on the crosswind side. He looked at the slope. He made some calculation that Evelyn couldn't follow entirely, but whose result was apparent in how he turned his horse back to face forward. We don't stop, he said. We don't speed up. We ride this trail like it's any other morning. He looked at Dolan. You and Breeze stay loose. Dolan made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated complete understanding. Cole pulled his horse alongside Cora and looked at Evelyn directly. Talk to me, he said. She looked at him. What? Talk to me, about anything, like we're 2 people on a trail on a regular morning. He kept his eyes moving as he spoke, natural and unhurried, but she understood the instruction. 2 people in easy conversation on a familiar trail were a different picture than 4 tense riders scanning the slopes. Tell me about the accounts, what you found in Aldis's system. She understood. She turned her eyes to the trail ahead and began talking, keeping her voice natural, telling him about the double entry problem she'd found in the October feed accounts, how Aldis had been categorizing certain supply expenses under 2 different headings simultaneously, and how once she'd found the pattern, it opened up 6 months of records that needed to be reconciled. Cole asked questions, real ones. He understood enough about account management to engage with the substance of what she was saying, and the conversation was genuine even in its purpose. And she was both genuinely talking about ledger reconciliation and listening with every part of her attention to the eastern slope. The two horses on the slope kept pace, not approaching, not falling behind. They were being escorted or herded. "Cole," she said, keeping her voice at the same level. "I know," he said. "They're moving us, not following us. I know. Where does this trail go if we don't drop down at the north pasture? If we keep going along the ridge?" He was quiet for one beat. "Red Rock Canyon, dead end." "Are there other ways down from the pass?" "One. A scramble trail on the west face, steep, not rideable." She thought about this. "So if there's someone ahead of us, then we've got 3 directions covered," he said, quietly, without any change in his tone. "Yes." She let that sit for approximately 5 seconds. "What do we do?" "We see what's ahead before we decide." He shifted his reins. "And Dolan?" "Yeah," Dolan said from behind, casual as discussing lunch. "Take the left when I say." "Understood." They rode. The exposed ridge was the longest half-mile Evelyn had covered in her life, and she'd been on some bad miles. She kept her eyes forward and her back straight and her hands easy on the reins because Cora was a sensible horse, but sensible horses respond to their riders, and if she gripped and tensed, the mare would feel it. She breathed. She thought about ledger entries. She kept her voice steady through 2 more exchanges about the Crosswinds accounts that she was 90% certain Cole wasn't listening to at all. Then the trail curved left around a rock outcrop and Cole said simply, "There." A single rider on a brown horse, sitting in the middle of the trail about 80 yards ahead, not trying to be hidden, waiting. "That's not Rains," Cole said. "No," Evelyn agreed. The build was wrong, heavier, shorter. "Do you know him?" "No," Dolan said from behind. "I do." A pause. "He rode for the Kettrick outfit 2 seasons back. Name's Fowler. He's not fast, but he doesn't spook easy." Cole pulled them to a stop. The man on the brown horse didn't move. The 2 horses on the eastern slope had stopped moving as well. Evelyn could feel them without seeing them, the way you feel eyes on the back of your neck. Cole called out at a volume that carried the 80 yards without strain. "What do you want, Fowler?" The man on the brown horse said, loud enough to carry back, "Rains wants to talk to the woman." A silence. Cole's voice stayed flat. "She's not available to talk." "He's not asking." A longer silence. Evelyn looked at Cole's profile. He was very still. She could see his jaw work slightly, which was the closest thing to visible tension she'd seen from him in 6 weeks. She said quietly, to Cole only, "If there are 3 directions covered, they planned this before we left Millhaven." "Yes." "Which means someone in Millhaven told Rains we were there." "Yes." "Aldridge?" "Not Aldridge," he said. "Someone else. Hotel, maybe. Doesn't matter right now." She looked at Fowler on the brown horse. She thought about something Aldridge had said. He may decide to act before the warrant moves through. She thought, this is what deciding to act looks like. Cole turned his head slightly toward her, keeping his eyes on Fowler. "I need you to trust me right now," he said. Very quiet. Not a demand, not a reassurance, just a request, stated plainly. "Can you do that?" She looked at him. She thought about a road in Wyoming and a stranger on a horse who hadn't had to stop and who had stopped anyway. She thought about a spade and a cottonwood tree and careful hands that had done a thing without being asked. She thought about 6 weeks of doorways and account ledgers and the particular quality of a man who says what he means and doesn't say what he doesn't. "Yes," she said. He turned back to Fowler, and then he did something she hadn't expected at all. He reached into his coat and took out a folded piece of paper and held it up, clearly visible, at a height that the men on the eastern slope could see as well. "That's a sworn statement," Cole called out, "witnessed by a deputy territorial marshal and registered with the land office in Millhaven. It names Cliff Rains by description, by the name he was addressed by his own men, and by the specific details of a killing committed on the Western Road 6 weeks ago." He paused. "The original is already filed. What I'm holding is a copy. There are 2 others." Fowler hadn't moved. "Rains wants to talk to the woman," Cole continued. "He can talk to Elias Aldridge instead. That's the only conversation that's available to him now. Another silence. The wind off the ridge moved through the scrub and the bare aspens and said nothing useful. Then Fowler turned his horse to the side of the trail and waited. Cole rode forward at a walk. He rode straight past Fowler without looking at him, and Evelyn came alongside, and then Dolan, and then Breeze, and Fowler sat his horse and watched them pass and didn't move, and the two horses on the eastern slope didn't move, and they rode down off the ridge into the protected country below, and the trees closed around them. Nobody spoke for almost 10 minutes. Then Dolan said, to no one in particular, "Hell of a piece of paper." Cole said nothing. Evelyn looked at him. "Was any of that true? Multiple copies? Registered?" Aldridge registered the original. "There's one copy, which is this." He held up the paper briefly, then put it away. The part about multiple copies was approximate. "You were bluffing." "I was presenting the situation in its most discouraging light." She considered this. "That's a meaningful distinction." "It is to me," he said. She almost said something and then didn't, because they were still on the trail, and the situation was not resolved. And what she wanted to say required more time and steadiness than the current moment had available. She filed it away instead. She was learning, a considerable filing system for things that had to wait. They came out onto the north pasture of the crosswind as the afternoon light went thin and silver through the clouds, and the familiar shapes of the buildings appeared on the far side of the grass, and she felt the particular relief of a place that had become, without her quite deciding it had, something like home. Cole was quiet the whole ride across the pasture. She rode beside him and didn't try to fill the silence, because the silence had the quality of a man thinking through something and reaching a conclusion rather than the silence of a man with nothing to say. When they reached the yard and handed the horses to a hand who came to take them, and Dolan and Breeze headed for the bunkhouse and the warmth it represented, Cole stopped in the yard. She stopped too. "The accounts," he said. "Hargrove's partner in the land office. I've been thinking about it since Millhaven." She waited. "It needs to move," he said. "I've been careful for 2 years, and careful has its limits. Rains on that ridge today was those limits." "You're going to go get them." "I'm going to try." He paused. "It means time away from the crosswind. A week, maybe more." She looked at him. "You're telling me because you asked me about it," he said. "And because you have a right to know what's happening around you. Harlan will know, but I wanted you to know directly." She turned that over. He'd given her the information not because she needed it to make a decision, but because she'd asked an honest question and deserved an honest answer. That was a specific kind of respect, and she recognized it because her father had practiced it. "When?" she said. 2 weeks. Maybe 3. I need to plan it right." She nodded. She started toward the house. Then she stopped, because something had been sitting in the back of her mind since the ridge, and she might as well say it while she still had the particular steadiness that cold air and near escapes produce. "Cole." He looked at her. "The paper," she said. "You held it up so the men on the slope could see it, not just Fowler." "Yes." "You wanted them to report back to Rains." "Yes." "You wanted Rains to know that threatening me now accomplishes nothing, that the statement is already filed and nothing he does to me changes that." "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You used the statement to protect me." He said nothing, which was its own answer. She felt something shift in the center of her chest. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in the stories she'd read, but the way things actually shift, which is usually quietly and without announcement, and which you only fully recognize later when you look back at the moment and understand what it was. "Don't get yourself killed going after those accounts," she said. Something brief and not quite a smile moved across his face. "I'll do my best." She went inside. He stood in the yard for a moment longer, and then he went to find Harlan, and the crosswind settled into its evening routine around both of them, and the mountains held the last of the day's light for as long as they could before they let it go. He left on a Thursday, before anyone else was up. Evelyn knew because she heard the horse in the yard at an hour when the yard had no business having a horse in it, and she went to the window and saw him in the dark below, checking the cinch on his saddle with the particular focus of a man who checks things twice. Not from anxiety, but from the understanding that details matter and the road doesn't forgive the ones you skip. He had a pack tied behind the saddle and his rifle in the scabbard. and nothing about his posture suggested he was doing anything other than heading out on ordinary business. She almost went down. She stood at the window with her hand on the cold glass and thought about going down, and then thought about what she would say when she got there, and couldn't find anything that wasn't either too much or not enough. So she stayed at the window and watched him mount and ride north toward the pass, and she stood there after he was gone until the cold from the glass had moved through her palm and up her arm far enough to make the point. And then she went back to bed and lay awake until morning, thinking about buried account books in a land office somewhere, and a man riding toward them in the dark. He'd told Harlan he'd be back within 2 weeks. He'd said 2, maybe 3, when he'd told her, which she noted was a different number and filed away without knowing entirely what to do with the difference. The 2 weeks that followed were the busiest she'd been since arriving at the Crosswind, which she suspected was not entirely accidental. Harlan Gibbs was a perceptive man, and perceptive men sometimes arranged for other people to have less time to think about things by ensuring there was more work than time to do it in. She didn't resent this. The work was real and it needed doing, and she threw herself into the year-end accounts with the kind of focus that had kept her sane in the worst weeks after her father's death. Aldous Pratt's eyesight had deteriorated enough that he was now coming in only 3 mornings a week, mostly to answer her questions about historical entries that his notation made opaque. She'd restructured the entire filing system by the end of the first week after Cole left, moving from Aldis's idiosyncratic categories to a clean double-entry system that would be legible to any competent accountant who came after her. This was, she told herself, a practical consideration rather than any statement about her own plans, and she mostly believed it. Harlan came to look at the new system on the 8th day and stood at her desk for about 10 minutes, turning pages without saying anything. Then he said, "This is better than what we had." "It should make the spring audit straightforward," she said. He set the ledger down. "Aldous will take some convincing." "Aldous has already agreed. I explained the reconciliation problem in the October feed accounts and showed him how the new system would have caught it automatically. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, 'Well, that does make more sense.'" Harlan raised both eyebrows, which on his face was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "You got Aldous to say something makes more sense." I used very small words and a great deal of patience. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh. "Thomas said you were stubborn and practical. He didn't mention persuasive." "He didn't think of it as persuasion," she said. "He called it being right until the other person got tired of being wrong." Harlan left the office still making that sound. On the 11th day, word came from Aldridge. Not through the mail, a writer, which meant it was urgent enough that Aldridge had paid for the service rather than waiting for the regular postal run. Harlan read the letter in his office and called Evelyn in, and she sat across from him and watched his face while he read it a second time, which told her the first time had not been entirely comfortable. "Warrant's been signed," he said, "for Rains." He set the letter down. "But Aldridge says there's a complication." She waited. "The sheriff in Rains's county, the one with the arrangement, has been tipped that the warrant's coming. Aldridge thinks Rains may already know." He looked at the letter again. "The marshal's office is moving as fast as they can, but fast in the territorial system means days, not hours." "So Rains has a window," Evelyn said. "A narrow one. But yes." "What does Aldridge recommend?" "That you stay on the Crosswind until the arrest is made and he sends confirmation." Harlan looked at her over the top of the letter. "I was already planning to say the same thing regardless of what Aldridge recommended." She nodded. She wasn't going anywhere. She'd made her statement and done her part, and the rest of it was in the hands of people with different tools than she had. Understanding the limits of what you could control was something her father had spent years trying to teach her, and she'd spent years resisting, and somewhere in the last 3 months she'd arrived at a version of it that actually worked. What she couldn't control: Rains, the warrant, the sheriff's arrangement, the territorial marshal's timeline. What she could control: the ledgers, her own preparation, the quality of her work. She went back to the accounts. She didn't sleep particularly well for the next 3 nights, but she was functional during the days and the ledgers got done, and she decided this was the acceptable version of not sleeping well. Cole came back on the 14th day. He rode in around 2 in the afternoon, looking like a man who had covered a great deal of ground in a short time and hadn't prioritized sleep on the journey. His horse was tired. He was tired. He handed the animal to a hand without his usual checking of the cinch and walked toward the main house with a directness that brought Harlan out onto the porch before Cole had covered half the yard, because Harlan had a sense for when something had happened that needed to be dealt with immediately. Evelyn was at her desk and heard the voices on the porch, and then heard Harlan call her name, which he'd never done before in the middle of a working day. She came out. Cole was on the porch, still in his travel coat, and he was holding an oilskin packet tied with twine. He looked at her when she came through the door, and something moved across his face that was relief and exhaustion in roughly equal parts. "You get it?" she asked. "Most of it," he said. He looked at Harlan. "I need to sit down." They went inside. He told it plainly in the way he told everything, the sequence, the facts, without drama. He'd ridden to Garrison County, where Hargrove's partner in the land office operated. The partner's name was Vetch, and Vetch had, as Cole suspected, the original account books from Hargrove's operation, the ones that showed Roy Casper's systematic skimming, and more relevantly, the ones that showed Hargrove's subsequent falsification of records to support the story he'd taken to the law. "How did you get them?" Harlan asked. Vetch wasn't entirely happy about what he'd been holding, Cole said. He'd been holding it for 2 years because Hargrove paid him, and because Vetch was afraid of what happened to people who crossed Hargrove. But Hargrove died in August. Fell off a horse. He said this without particular satisfaction. Vetch had been sitting on the account since then trying to decide what to do. I showed up and made the decision easier. "You threatened him," Harlan said. "I explained his situation clearly," Cole said. "There's a difference." Harlan looked at the oilskin packet. "What's in there?" "The original accounts, 3 years of them, and a written statement from Vetch confirming how they came to be in his possession." Cole put his hand on the packet. "Enough to take to the territorial court and get the charges against me dismissed. Enough to reopen the question of how Roy Casper died." He paused. "Which, for the record, is exactly the way I told it." "I know how Roy Casper died," Harlan said. "I did my own checking before I hired you." Cole looked at him. "You never said." "You didn't ask." Harlan stood up. "I'll send this to my lawyer in Cheyenne tonight. We'll start the process." He picked up the packet, then looked at Evelyn, then at Cole. "You both look like you need to eat something. Mrs. Tully made a beef stew this morning that she'll be offended if we don't acknowledge." He left them alone in the office. Evelyn looked at Cole across the desk. He was still in his coat. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there when he left, and the cut above his eyebrow, long since healed, had a new small bruise beside it that she decided not to ask about immediately. 2 weeks, she said. "You said 2 weeks." "I know." He looked at the desk. Vetch took some convincing. She looked at the bruise. "He came around eventually," Cole said, which did not actually answer the question she hadn't asked. She decided to let it go. "Aldridge sent word the warrant's been signed." Cole looked up. "Raines may already know it's coming," she said. "Aldridge thinks the window is narrow." She watched him process this, the slight tension, the reassessment. "Raines makes his money on that western road," Cole said. "If the warrant's moving, his best option is to run, not to come here." "That's what Aldridge said." "It's also what a man who's been running operations for 10 years would understand about his own situation." He rubbed a hand over his face. "If he's smart about it, he runs. If he decides he's not going to run," he stopped. "If he decides that," she said, "what does it look like?" "It looks like what happened on Harker's Pass, but with more men and a clear intention." He said it straight. "But Raines isn't that man. He's a coward in the specific way that men who hurt people who can't fight back are cowards. He avoids situations where the other side has real options." "We have real options," she said. "We do," he agreed. She looked at him across the desk. He looked back. The afternoon light was thin and gray through the window behind her, and it made the office feel smaller than it was, which she didn't find unpleasant. "Go eat something," she said, "and sleep. Whatever needs thinking through can wait until morning." He nodded. He stood up and picked up his coat from the back of the chair where he'd dropped it, and he was almost to the door when she said his name. He stopped. "I'm glad you're back," she said. She said it the way she said things she meant, directly, without softening it into something more manageable. He stood with his back to her for just a moment. Then he turned and looked at her, and the tiredness in his face was still there, but something else was in it too, something she recognized because she'd been feeling a version of it herself for the better part of 3 weeks. "So am I," he said. He went to find Mrs. Tully's stew. December arrived hard, the way Wyoming winters tend to. Not gradually, not with any courtesy of transition, but with a 3-day storm that dropped a foot of snow on the valley and tested every piece of equipment on the ranch simultaneously. The creek in the north pasture froze in a way that required daily braking for the cattle. 2 fence lines came down under the weight of accumulated snow and needed emergency repair in the kind of cold that made tools handle awkwardly and fingers lose their feeling in 20 minutes. Cole ran the hands through it with the particular focused calm of someone who knows exactly which things need to happen in what order and can communicate this without raising his voice. Evelyn watched this from the window some mornings while she was getting the office fire going, and she thought about the wanted poster in her tin box and about what a different story the drawing on it told compared with the actual person. She went out on the 3rd day of the storm. She hadn't planned it. She'd come out to the barn for a reason she could no longer remember and found 2 of the younger hands struggling with the fence repair on the east side, while Dolan directed from a position that suggested his knees were giving him trouble in the cold. She took the end of the wire that the younger hand was fighting with and held it properly while he set the staple, and she stayed for another hour and a half holding, fetching, and doing what was needed without being asked, and came back inside with hands that were stiff for the rest of the afternoon and a particular feeling of satisfaction that she'd missed and hadn't realized she'd missed. Cole found her in the office later that afternoon, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, the account books open in front of her. "Dolan says you were on the east fence. Dolan talks too much," she said. "He does," Cole agreed. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She looked at the ledger. "I wanted to." He leaned against the doorframe. His coat was still damp from the morning's work, and his hat had a ring of melted snow around the brim. "You're going to want to start writing," he said. She looked up. "In the spring," he said, "when the ground firms up. If you want to understand this operation the way you'd need to in order to manage it properly, you need to know it from the ground, not just from the accounts." She studied him. "Harlan hasn't said anything about me managing it." "Harlan doesn't say things until he's ready to say them," Cole said. "But I know what he thinks about your work. And I know the operation needs someone who can handle both the range end and the books end, and right now those are 2 different people and one of them is going blind." She was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me this because you should be making decisions with full information," he said. "Same reason as always." She looked at the ledger again. Outside, the wind was doing something complicated with the snow against the window. "I don't know how to ride properly," she said. "Well enough to get somewhere, not well enough for ranch work." "I know," he said. "I'll teach you." She looked at him. "In the spring," he said. "All right," she said. He pushed off the doorframe and went back to the yard, and she turned to the account books with something warm and slightly inconvenient sitting in the middle of her chest, and she worked until the light was gone. The letter from Aldridge came on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of December. Cliff Raines had been arrested at the Wyoming-Nebraska border, attempting to cross with 3 horses that didn't belong to him and a quantity of cash that bore looking into. The original warrant from Evelyn's statement had been served simultaneously. He was in territorial custody. The sheriff with the arrangement had been notified that his arrangement was known about, which had produced what Aldridge described, with the understated satisfaction of a careful man delivering good news, as a remarkable willingness to cooperate with the marshal's office. Harlan read the letter at supper and handed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it a second time. Then she folded it and set it on the table and picked up her fork and finished her supper, and nobody said anything, because they all understood that some news doesn't need commentary. Later, after supper, she went out onto the porch in the cold. She'd taken to doing this some evenings, standing in the cold for a few minutes before bed, her father's habit that she'd apparently absorbed without deciding to. And Cole came out behind her and stood at the railing. "You heard?" she said. "Harlan told me." She looked out at the valley. The snow was blue-white in the dark, and the mountains were black shapes against a sky full of stars that the storm had left behind when it moved on. "I keep thinking about telling him," she said. "My father." Cole said nothing. "He would have wanted to know how it came out," she said. "He was like that. He liked to know how things ended." She wasn't looking for a response, and Cole didn't offer one, which was exactly right. He just stood at the railing beside her and let her have the moment without turning it into anything it didn't need to be. After a while, she said, "Your case. Harlan's lawyer." "Moving," Cole said. "Slow, but moving. These things take time." "Will it actually be resolved, fully?" "I think so, yes." He paused. "For the first time in 2 years, I think so." She heard what was underneath that. Not the legal resolution specifically, but what the legal resolution meant. 2 years of being a man positioned near exits, planning for multiple contingencies, keeping his life arranged for departure. The exhaustion of that, done long enough, becomes something a person doesn't even notice carrying anymore, and then something changes, and the weight of it becomes apparent all at once. "What do you do," she said, "when you're not running anymore?" "I've been thinking about that," he said. "And?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to stay here," he said, "if there's a reason to." She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the valley, not at her. His profile in the starlight was very still. "That's not nothing," she said carefully. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at the valley too. The cold was deep now, the kind that makes your eyes water, and she could see her breath in small clouds when she exhaled. "I'm not good at certain things," she said, asking for help, letting people close without keeping some distance available. "My father said it was my worst feature." "What did you say?" "I said it was a survival mechanism that had served me well, and he said survival mechanisms and good ways of living are not always the same thing, and I said I'd think about it." She paused. "I've been thinking about it." He turned his head then and looked at her. This close, in this light, she could see the gray-green of his eyes that had first caught her attention on a road in Wyoming and had continued catching her attention in various contexts ever since. "I'm not easy either," he said. "I disappear inside my own head when I'm working something through. I don't explain myself well when I'm tired. I've spent 2 years being careful enough that I'm not sure I remember how to be otherwise." "That's a fair accounting," she said. "You deserve a fair accounting." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked back at the valley and she said, "In the spring, when you teach me to ride properly, yes. I'd like that to be the beginning of something, not just the riding." A silence. "So would I," he said. Quiet and without elaboration, the way he said things he meant. She stood at the railing for another minute in the deep cold, shoulder to shoulder with him, looking at the valley below and the mountains above and the stars above those, and then she went inside because the cold had reached the point of diminishing returns. He stayed on the porch a while longer. She knew this because she heard the faint creak of the railing from her room above, and she lay in the dark and thought about spring with something that felt like looking forward, an experience she hadn't had in long enough that she'd half convinced herself she'd lost the ability. She hadn't. January moved slowly, and then, as January sometimes does, all at once. The news from Harlan's lawyer in Cheyenne came in stages. First the filing, then the hearing date, then the result, which arrived on a cold afternoon in the third week of January in a letter that Harlan brought to the office personally and set on Evelyn's desk rather than opening it himself. She looked at it. "It's addressed to you." "Open it anyway," Harlan said. "You've got as much stake in it as I do." She opened it. The charges against Cole Bennett, armed robbery and involvement in the death of Roy Casper, had been dismissed by the territorial court. The account books, Vetch's statement, and a re-examination of the original witness testimony in light of established inconsistencies had been sufficient for the judge. The record was cleared. She read it twice. Then she folded it and went to find Cole. He was in the barn, working on a piece of harness that had split in the cold. He looked up when she came in and read her expression before she said a word, which was its own kind of language between people who've spent enough time paying attention to each other. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. She watched his face, and what moved through it was not triumph or relief exactly. It was something quieter and more profound than either, the expression of a man who has been carrying something for so long that putting it down changes his posture in ways he hasn't figured out yet. He folded the letter. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I don't know what to do with this," he said, honest in the specific way of someone who has been guarding himself so long that good news lands strangely. "You don't have to do anything with it today," she said. "It'll still be true tomorrow." He looked at the letter again. Then he set it on the workbench beside the harness and picked up his needle and thread, and she sat on a hay bale near the barn door and kept him company while he worked, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and that was exactly the right thing. Well, the storm that hit in the first week of February was different from the December storm in the way that a second blow is always different from the first. You've had time to get comfortable in the in-between, and then it arrives and reminds you what the territory actually is underneath its better moods. It came in the night. By morning, the snow was at the windowsills of the bunkhouse, and the wind was the kind that makes walls feel thin. Harlan assessed it at breakfast with the expression of a man who has seen worse and is not prepared to claim this was it, and began organizing the work of keeping a large cattle operation functional in the face of weather that would prefer it wasn't. Cole was everywhere that day. Evelyn tracked this without meaning to. In the north pasture breaking ice in the morning, at the barn sorting the feed situation at midday, at the east fence line in the afternoon where a section had come down again under the combination of snow and wind. She heard his voice in the yard and in the corridor and once outside the office window, giving directions to young Will about the water barrel situation with the patient precision of a man who knows the difference between a task done adequately and a task done in a way that doesn't need redoing. She went out at 3 in the afternoon, not because she was asked, but because the feed situation Harlan had mentioned at lunch was larger than 2 men could reasonably manage in the time before dark, and she'd done the arithmetic. The wind was extraordinary. She kept her head down and moved between the main barn and the storage barn in stages. And she worked alongside Dolan and Breeze and Will for 2 hours, hauling feed and breaking paths through the drifts and doing whatever the task immediately in front of her required. Cole came in from the east fence at 4:45 with ice on his coat and his hands red from cold and found her at the storage barn door with a barrow of feed. He stopped. "You've been out here all afternoon," he said. Not an accusation, assessment. "The arithmetic required it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she couldn't name precisely, but recognized as belonging to the category of things that had been building since a road in Wyoming and had been slowly, imperfectly, honestly finding their shape. "Get inside," he said. "I've got this." "We've got this," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the other handle of the barrow. "Other end," he said. She took it. They moved the barrow together toward the main barn, into the wind, and the storm made the kind of noise around them that reduced everything down to what was immediately necessary and immediately true. Later, when the work was done and the animals were as well situated as the storm allowed, and the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse and Harlan had gone in to his supper, Cole and Evelyn stood in the doorway of the main barn for a moment, looking out at the white dark of the yard. "Storm will break by morning," he said. "How do you know?" "The wind's shifting, comes around from the northwest when it's ending." He paused. "You can feel it change." She stood in the doorway and tried to feel it, and maybe she could, just at the edges, some small alteration in the quality of the cold. "Cole," she said. "Hmm?" "When the case is fully settled," she stopped, started again, because she'd started wrong. "I've been thinking about what you said on the porch, that you'd like to stay here, if there's a reason." He waited. "I'm not saying I'm the reason," she said carefully. "I'm saying I'd like to be, if that's something that could be true." She paused. "That's probably not the clearest I've ever said anything." "It's clear enough," he said. "Is it?" "Yes." He turned his head and looked at her. "I've been clear about it since Red Willow, if you were paying attention." "I was paying attention," she said. "I was also being careful." "I know," he said. "I wasn't going to push it." "I know you weren't." She looked at the storm. "My father would have told me I waited too long. He had no patience for people who let caution do the work of cowardice." "I wouldn't have said that." "No," she agreed. "You wouldn't." She turned and looked at him. "Ask me something." He looked at her. "What?" "I'm not going to do this first," she said. "I've done most things first because most things required it, not this." Something moved across his face. First surprise, then something warmer, then the particular expression of a man who has just been handed something he wasn't certain he'd ever get to receive. He turned toward her in the barn doorway. "Evelyn," he said. Just her name. First time he'd used it, she realized, in all the weeks. "Yes," she said. "I haven't got a ring." I didn't ask for a ring. I'm just saying. He looked at her with that not quite smile. When I ask, there should be a ring. She looked at him. Then ask me when there's a ring. All right, he said. I will. I know you will, she said. The storm blew around the barn and the wind shifted slightly from the northwest, and Cole Bennett stood in the doorway beside Evelyn Mercer and looked out at the Wyoming winter with the expression of a man who has found, through considerable inconvenience and across more distance than ought to have been required, something that was going to last. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. The wind said enough for both of them, and they stood there and listened to it, and somewhere in the valley the cattle waited out the storm, and the mountains held their snow, and the cold, deep night moved slowly toward the morning Cole had promised was coming. Cole kept his word about the ring. He found it in the first week of March, when the storm had been gone long enough that the roads were passable again, and a man could make the ride to Millhaven without it being an act of stubbornness. He didn't tell Evelyn he was going specifically for that purpose. He told her he had business with Aldridge, which was also true, a follow-up on the Rains prosecution that Aldridge had requested in writing. And he rode out on a Tuesday and came back on a Thursday, and the business with Aldridge had apparently gone well, and he didn't mention the other thing. She noticed the trip had taken 2 days when the Aldridge business could have been handled in one, and she filed this observation away with all the other things she'd been filing since a road in Wyoming, and she went back to the spring accounts and said nothing. He asked her on a Saturday evening. The snow had pulled back enough from the south pasture that the first brown grass was showing through. The particular exhausted color of ground that has been buried for months and is only beginning to remember what it was. Evelyn had been out riding with Cole that afternoon, her 3rd week of proper instruction, and she was improving faster than she'd expected, partly because she was stubborn about things she wanted to be good at, and partly because Cora was a patient and honest horse who communicated her opinions about a rider's errors directly and without malice. They'd come back along the ridge that looked out over the whole valley, and Cole had stopped there in the last of the afternoon light without explanation, which was not unusual for him. He stopped to look at things when he felt like stopping, and she'd learned not to read it as anything beyond that. She pulled Cora up beside his horse and looked where he was looking. The valley was enormous and still, the mountains above it capped with snow that was going to take until June to fully release. The sky, a particular deep blue that only appeared in March in Wyoming when the air was clean from months of cold and the light was beginning to remember how to be warm. Below them, the Crosswinds buildings were small and dark against the white and brown quilt of the pasture, and the cattle were visible in the south field, and smoke rose from the main house chimney in a straight line because the wind had stopped. It doesn't look like much from up here, Evelyn said, and it looks like everything. Yes, Cole said. She looked at him. He was reaching into his coat pocket. He took out a ring, small, plain gold, with a single small stone that caught the last of the afternoon light when he held it out. Not dramatically, not on one knee, just held it out in his palm the way a man offers something he's been carrying carefully and is relieved to finally put in the right hands. My mother's, he said. She gave it to me before she died 12 years ago. Said to give it to someone worth it. Evelyn looked at the ring in his palm. She thought about 12 years of a man carrying something like that through the kinds of years he'd had, through Roy Casper and Hargrove and wanted posters, and 2 years of managing his exits, carrying it and not losing it, and not giving up on the idea of a person worth giving it to. Cole, she said. I know I'm not easy, he said. I know the record's cleared, but the years that made it aren't gone. I know I disappear inside my head and don't explain myself when I'm tired, and I've spent so long being careful that I'm still figuring out how to stop. He looked at the ring in his hand. I'm not offering you a finished man. I'm offering you an honest one. She looked at him for a moment. The light was going gold and low, and the valley was very quiet. Yes, she said. Same words she'd said in the barn doorway in February, same way she said things she meant, without softening, without the qualifying clauses that caution builds around itself. He put the ring on her finger. It fit almost exactly, which neither of them commented on because some things don't require commentary. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. Your mother had good taste in stones. She had good taste in most things, he said. She would have liked you. How do you know? Because she had no patience for people who dressed their thoughts up in things they weren't, he said. She said most people's biggest problem was they didn't say what they meant until it was too late to matter. He paused. You always say what you mean. My father said it was my best feature, Evelyn said. My only social liability and my best feature simultaneously. He was right on both counts, Cole said. She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost, which on her face was its own thing, and which Cole had learned to read the same way he read weather. Not the dramatic version, but the actual version, which was more useful. They sat on the ridge for a few more minutes in the cooling air, and then rode back down to the crosswind with the ring on her finger and the valley opening up around them as they descended. And that was that. Harlan Gibbs, when told, shook Cole's hand for a long time without speaking. Then he went to find Mrs. Tully, who cried briefly and efficiently, and then went to start planning something involving food, which was her primary language of significant emotion. Dolan said, "Well, it's about time," to no one in particular, which prompted young Will to ask what he meant, and Dolan to explain that some things were obvious to people who were paying attention, and that Will should consider paying more attention. Aldous Pratt, when Evelyn told him, looked at the ring and then at her and said, Bennett, he knows cattle. This appeared to be his complete assessment, and she found it coming from Aldous, something close to a benediction. They were married in the second week of December, 14 months after Evelyn Mercer had watched her father buried under a cottonwood tree on a Wyoming road and followed a stranger into an uncertain future. The wedding was small, which was what both of them wanted. The territorial judge came out from Mill Haven, the same judge, as it happened, who had signed the dismissal of the charges against Cole, which gave the proceeding a certain satisfying circularity. Harlan stood for Cole. Evelyn had written to Mrs. Aldrich in Red Willow, who had made the trip at her own expense and arrived 2 days early and spent both days helping Mrs. Tully in the kitchen with an efficiency that suggested these two women were going to be, at minimum, respectful adversaries. Aldrich sent a letter that arrived the day before, congratulating them and noting that Cliff Raines had been sentenced to 12 years in the Territorial Penitentiary for the murder of Thomas Mercer and 2 prior offenses that the investigation had subsequently uncovered. He wrote it in the restrained language of a careful official, but the satisfaction in it was legible to anyone who knew how to read between formally constructed sentences. Evelyn read the letter at the kitchen table the morning before the wedding and sat with it for a long time. 12 years. It would not bring her father back. She had long since arrived at the understanding that justice and restoration were not the same thing, and that confusing them was a way of ensuring you were perpetually disappointed in the former. What it did was close a door that had been standing open since September, letting the cold in. She could feel it close. It was not a comfortable feeling exactly. More like the particular ache of a joint when it finally moves back into its proper position after being wrong for a long time. She put the letter in the tin box with her mother's miniature and the deed to the homestead land and the wanted poster with Cole's name on it, which she'd decided to keep for reasons she hadn't entirely articulated even to herself. Evidence, maybe. Evidence that a story can be more than its worst chapter. She went to find Cole. He was in the barn, which was where he usually was when he had something to think through, and he was doing the same thing he'd been doing when she'd brought him the dismissal letter, working with his hands while his mind was elsewhere. This time it was a bridle he was cleaning, systematic and unhurried. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. "Aldridge's letter," she said. "I heard." He set the bridle down. "You all right?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. "I think so," she said. "I think what I feel is that it's finished, and I didn't know how heavy finished would feel until it arrived." He nodded. He understood, she knew, the particular weight of things being over. He'd carried his own version for 2 years. "Your father would have wanted this," he said. "The result." "He would have wanted to be here," she said. "He would have liked the wedding more. He liked occasions." Cole almost smiled. "Then we have it in his honor," he said. "Make it worth the occasion." She looked at him across the barn. "He would have liked you," she said. "I told you that once, on a cold morning on a road to Mill Haven." "I remember." "I meant it then. I mean it more now." She leaned against the doorframe. "He would have said you were a man who understood that character is what you do when nobody's making you, and he would have said that was the only definition of the word that mattered." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's a good definition." "He was a smart man." She pushed off the doorframe. Come inside. Mrs. Tully says you need to eat before tonight, and that if you say you're not hungry, she will take it as a personal affront. He picked up the bridle again. 5 minutes. She said to tell you 5 minutes means 3. He put the bridle down and came. The wedding itself was exactly what it was, imperfect and real and theirs. The judge stumbled over a word in the middle of the proceeding and lost his place and had to start the sentence again, which broke a tension in the room that nobody had known was there until it broke. Harlan cried, which he'd announced beforehand he had no intention of doing, and which surprised nobody. Mrs. Aldrich and Mrs. Tully appeared to have resolved whatever adversarial energy had been building between them by the simple mechanism of both of them being moved at the same moment, which produced a brief, unlikely alliance. Cole said his part in the flat, direct way he said everything that mattered, looking at Evelyn with the steadiness she'd first noticed on a road in Wyoming and had been noting, in one context after another, ever since. She said hers the same way, because there was no other way she knew how to mean something. When it was done, Harlan opened a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a specific occasion without knowing yet what the occasion would be, and Mrs. Tully produced food in quantities that suggested she'd been planning this for considerably longer than anyone had announced the wedding. And Dolan told a story about a cattle drive that may or may not have been true, but was certainly entertaining, and young Will drank 1 glass of whiskey more than was strictly advisable, and said several sincere and somewhat rambling things about how Cole was the best foreman he'd ever worked for, and Miss Mercer, Mrs. Bennett, was the only reason the October accounts had made sense, and then Dolan guided him kindly toward a chair. Evelyn sat at the table in the warm main room of the Crosswind and looked at the people around her and thought about what family actually was, which was not, she'd concluded, about blood or origin or the circumstances you were born into. It was about the people who showed up, who stayed when the situation didn't require it, who learned the particular shape of who you were and accommodated it without asking you to be smaller. She thought about her father. She thought about how he would have sat exactly where she was sitting and eaten Mrs. Tully's food with enormous appreciation, and talked to Harlan Gibbs for hours about cattle and weather and the particular difficulties of Wyoming winters, and how he would have watched Cole across the room and nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when something confirmed a thing he'd already suspected. She missed him in the specific way of missing that doesn't get smaller with time, only more familiar. You learn to carry it differently, not better. It changes shape, but not weight. She'd learned this, and she'd had to keep learning it, and she suspected she'd keep learning it for the rest of her life, which was fine. Some things were worth carrying. Cole came and sat beside her when the evening had settled into its comfortable latter stages. Harlan and the judge deep in conversation about territorial water rights, Dolan and Breeze playing cards with the focused silence of men engaged in actual competition, young Will asleep in his chair. Cole put his hand over hers on the table. Just that. Not a word. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, the Wyoming winter was doing what Wyoming winters do, pressing on the walls, reminding anyone inside of the nature of the country they'd chosen. And inside the Crosswind, the fire was warm and the people were fed, and the evening was the kind that gets carried forward in memory, not because anything dramatic happened in it, but because everything in it was exactly what it was supposed to be. The year that followed was the hardest work of Evelyn's life, and she found, to her own surprise, that hard work of the right kind produces a satisfaction that easier work never reaches. She learned to ride the way Cole had promised to teach her, properly, range style, for the actual work of moving cattle and covering ground and spending 10 or 12 hours in the saddle without it destroying you. She was not naturally gifted at it. She was stubborn about it, which was the next best thing, and in some circumstances better, and by late spring she could keep pace with the hands on a routine drive, and by summer she was doing it without thinking about it, which was the real marker. She understood the operation from both ends now, the numbers on the page and the reality that produced them. This turned out to be a considerably more powerful combination than either alone. She could look at a supply order and understand not just whether the figures were correct, but whether the quantities made sense for the time of year and the condition of the stock and the weather patterns that Cole had been watching. She could look at a pasture rotation and understand not just the cattle management logic, but the feed cost implications across the season. Harlan, watching this develop over the course of the year, said nothing specific for a long time. Then, in the fall, He called her and Cole into his office and told them he'd been talking to his lawyer in Cheyenne about the structure of the operation and that he had a proposal. The proposal was a partnership, not a gift, not a courtesy, a genuine operational partnership with a share structure that reflected actual contribution and actual responsibility and actual skin in the game, as Harlan put it. He wanted Cole's management of the range operation and Evelyn's management of the business side to be formalized in a way that gave them both actual authority and actual stake. Cole looked at the proposal for a long time. Evelyn looked at it for a shorter time because she read faster, and the terms were, by any objective measure, fair. Why? Cole asked. He meant it as a real question, not skepticism. Because I'm 63 years old, Harlan said, and I've been running this operation alone since my wife died 8 years ago, and I am tired in the way that a man gets tired when he's been doing everything by himself for too long and has been too stubborn to admit it. He paused. And because your particular combination of abilities is worth more than what I'm currently paying for it, and if I don't make this worthwhile, you'll eventually go build something of your own, and I'll deserve what I get for being slow about it. Cole looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. Yes, they both said, not quite simultaneously, but close enough that Harlan, who had been watching them with the patient attention of someone waiting for a conclusion he'd already arrived at, permitted himself a small smile. They signed the papers in November. The lawyer came out from Cheyenne for the occasion, and Mrs. Tully made the kind of supper she made when things mattered, which was different in measurable ways from her regular cooking in that she put more of herself into it, though she would have denied this if asked. Harlan shook hands with both of them when the papers were signed and then said gruffly that he was going to bed because he was tired and he trusted them not to burn anything down, and went upstairs, and they heard his door close. And in the hall outside Harlan's office, Cole and Evelyn stood with the signed papers and looked at each other. Well, she said. Well, he agreed. She looked at the papers. He's been planning this for a year. At least, Cole said. He probably planned it before he knew I was coming, she said. He needed both pieces. He just didn't have both pieces yet. Cole considered this. Your father's letter. Thomas Mercer had written to Harlan Gibbs about his daughter's capabilities in terms that, she now understood, had told Harlan something specific about what was possible. She had arrived as a piece of a plan Harlan had been assembling in the patient, unhurried way of a man who understood that the right combination of people was worth waiting for. She thought about all the steps of it, the letter, the road, the wagon with the broken axle, the stranger on a horse who hadn't had to stop. There was a version of the story in which everything that happened to her was only loss. Her father, her plans, her sense of what the future looked like. She had lived inside that version for a while, in the first weeks after the road, and it was a true version as far as it went. Loss was loss. She was not going to be sentimental about what it had cost. But there was another version that was equally true, which was that every single thing she had now had come through that loss rather than despite it. Not as compensation. She would never have framed it as compensation, because that would have been an insult to her father's memory and to the real weight of what grief was. But as consequence. The road had not been the end of her story. It had been, in the brutal and indifferent way of events that don't know or care what they mean, the beginning of this one. She held both versions. That was, she'd come to believe, the only honest way to hold a life. All of it, the full accounting, without collapsing the losses into lessons or the gains into proof that everything worked out the way it was supposed to. Nothing was supposed to. Things happened, and you chose what to do with them, and you lived with the choosing, and eventually you looked back and the choosing was the story. Come on, Cole said. It's cold in this hall. They went into the fire. The baby arrived in October of the following year, which was, by any calculation, not the most convenient time for a ranch operation. October was when the fall drive was finishing and the year-end accounting was beginning, and the weather was starting to have opinions about how everything was going to go for the next 5 months. The timing was inconvenient, and the arrival itself was hard, and Mrs. Tully was there and was worth every bit of her considerable capability, and Evelyn, who had approached the entire prospect of childbirth with the practical acknowledgement that it was a significant medical undertaking and not an occasion for excessive sentimentality, found herself considerably less composed at the actual end of it than she'd planned to be. The baby was a girl. Cole held her in the barn cold of the October bedroom. Mrs. Tully had put him out during the worst of it and let him back in afterward, which was the arrangement he'd accepted with the specific speechlessness of a man who understood he had no standing to argue. And he looked at her with an expression Evelyn had never seen on his face before. She'd seen him tired, and she'd seen him resolved, and she'd seen him holding the letter that cleared his name with something close to disbelief. And she'd seen him on the ridge above the crosswind with the ring in his hand, and a kind of hope that had survived more than it had a right to. She'd never seen him look the way he looked at his daughter. She thought, that's what it looks like when someone who has been careful for years finds something he doesn't need to be careful about. She needs a name, Evelyn said. Her voice was rougher than usual, which she attributed to the day's exertions rather than any particular emotion, though she was not being fully honest with herself about this. I know. He was still looking at the baby. You had something in mind? Martha, Evelyn said. My mother's name. He looked at her. The name connected something. She could see it register, the chain of it, her mother she'd never known, and her father who'd raised her anyway, and the miniature portrait in the tin box. Martha, he said. He looked at the baby. Hello, Martha. Martha appeared unimpressed by the introduction, which was exactly right. She had the specific lack of interest in external events of a person who has just arrived somewhere after a significant journey and is focused on more immediate priorities. Mrs. Tully, who had been doing the things that needed doing with the efficiency of a woman who has been at many arrivals and knows what follows each one, paused in her work long enough to look at the baby and say, "Good lungs," which from Mrs. Tully was the highest possible rating. Harlan came in the evening and stood in the doorway and looked at the baby with the expression of a man who has been alone in a house for a long time and has forgotten what small people sound like. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Your father would have been glad," to Evelyn, and she said, "I know." And that was enough. The crosswind in the years that followed was not a simple place, and the work was not simple work, and the partnership was not without friction, because real partnerships never are. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a picture rather than a life. There were seasons where the cattle market dropped and the numbers that Evelyn put on paper were bad numbers, and there was nothing to be done about it except tighten what could be tightened and wait. There were winters that punished every decision made during the fall, and summers that punished every decision made during the winter. There were arguments, real ones, the kind that happen between people who are both stubborn and honest, and who hold strong views about how things ought to be done, and don't retreat from those views just because the other person is someone they love. Cole and Evelyn argued about the spring rotation schedule for 2 weeks in their second year of partnership, and neither of them fully conceded, and they arrived at a compromise that was worse than either of their original positions and better than the problem it was solving, which is usually how compromise works. They argued about whether to expand the herd in the third year, and about the hiring of a particular hand whom Cole wanted, and Evelyn was not sure about, and she turned out to be right about the hand and wrong about the herd expansion. And they both kept track of this informally and never mentioned it directly because they'd both been raised to understand that keeping score is what you do when you've confused competition with partnership. They figured it out, not smoothly, messily. The way real people figure out real things, with wrong turns and backtracking and the occasional moment of genuine exasperation that required one of them to go stand in the barn for 20 minutes before the conversation could continue productively. But they figured it out, and the operation grew, and Harlan watched it grow with the satisfaction of someone who made a bet in good faith and won it fairly. Martha grew too, at the rate children grow, which is always both slower and faster than seems possible. She learned to ride before she learned to read, which suited her, and she had Cole's quietness and Evelyn's directness and Harlan's ability to assess a situation without immediately announcing the assessment, and she was, as a combination, something neither of her parents had quite anticipated. She asked, at the age of 5, why there was a picture of a man on a paper in the tin box in her mother's room, the wanted poster. Evelyn had taken it out to show her something else, and Martha had found it with the unerring instinct of small children for things not meant for them. Evelyn thought about how to answer this for approximately 3 seconds, and then answered it directly, which was the only way she knew how. "That's your father," she said. "A long time ago, before I knew him, some people said bad things about him that weren't true." Martha looked at the drawing, then at her father, who was in the doorway. "That doesn't look like you," she said to Cole. Drawings like that never look right, Cole said. What did they say that wasn't true? That he did something wrong, Evelyn said. He didn't. And eventually the truth came out. Martha looked at the poster for another moment. What happened to the people who said the wrong things? Cole and Evelyn looked at each other. They were wrong, Evelyn said. And being wrong has its own consequences, usually. Martha appeared to find this satisfactory. She put the poster down and went to find something more interesting, which children always do when the adult explanation turns out to be less dramatic than anticipated. Cole picked up the poster and looked at it for a moment, and then handed it back to Evelyn, and she put it back in the tin box with the miniature portrait and the letters and the deed. She kept it. She would always keep it, not as a wound to return to, but as a record of where they'd come from, what it had cost, what the truth eventually looked like when it finally arrived. Records matter. Her father had taught her that. The accounts don't lie if you keep them honestly, and an honest account includes the bad columns alongside the good. There is a particular morning in late September that comes to Wyoming after the summer heat has broken and before the first hard frost. A morning where the air is so clear it almost hurts to look at the mountains, and the light has that specific quality of something that knows it's temporary and is giving its best because of it. Evelyn was on the South Ridge on one of those mornings, alone, which was not a thing she did often, but which she did sometimes because she had learned slowly and with some resistance that solitude was not the same as loneliness, and that she needed the former even though she'd spent a long time confusing the two. She could see the whole valley from here. The Crosswinds buildings, larger now than when she'd first seen them from the stage cresting the rise. They'd added a second barn and expanded the bunkhouse and built the small house that was theirs specifically, separate from the main house, with a porch that faced west because she'd insisted on it, and Cole had not argued. The south pasture was full of cattle. The creek was glinting where the morning light caught it. Somewhere below she could hear Martha's voice, carrying up from the yard in the particular high register of a child who has found something interesting and is announcing it. She thought about a road. She thought about it the way she thought about it now, which was different from how she'd thought about it in the first months. Not as a wound, not as a trauma held at arm's length, but as a fact that had happened and that she carried with her the same way she carried everything else. Her father was in that road. It was also in the miniature portrait and in the way she kept accounts, and in the way she said what she meant without dressing it up, and in the bone-deep practicality that had kept her together on the worst day of her life and every day since. He was also, in ways she couldn't entirely account for, in the valley below. In the decision she'd made to tell Harlan about Raines's letter. In the choice to go to Mill Haven. In every moment she'd chosen information over ignorance and action over waiting and honesty over the more comfortable alternative. Thomas Mercer had spent 18 years teaching her how to inhabit a situation without being defeated by it, and she had arrived here, on this ridge, on this morning, partly because of him. She heard Cole's horse before she heard him. He came up the ridge at an easy walk, not in a hurry, which meant he'd known she was here and had come not to retrieve her but to join her. He pulled up beside her and looked at the valley. Neither of them said anything for a while. That was the thing about what they'd built. Not just the operation, not just the partnership, but the particular daily texture of a life together. There was room in it for silence. There was room in it for difficulty and for error and for the slow, unbeautiful work of two imperfect people building something that would outlast the worst versions of either of them. There was room in it for grief that didn't go away, and for joy that arrived unexpectedly, and for all the ordinary hours between those things that made up most of what a life actually was. She had come to Wyoming not knowing what she was heading toward, only what she was leaving behind. She had followed a stranger on the worst day of her life because the alternative was worse. She had been afraid and careful and suspicious and slow to trust and occasionally wrong about the things she was careful about and right about the things she hadn't known to be careful about at all. She had not arrived anywhere she'd planned to arrive. She had arrived somewhere better, and the better part was not that it was comfortable or easy or settled into something she didn't have to keep working at. The better part was that it was real. Every piece of it had been earned, not in the sentimental sense of deserving what you receive, which she'd always found a convenient story that life declined to confirm, but in the actual sense of having been present for it, having made choices in it, having let it cost what it cost and stayed anyway. Martha found a toad, Cole said. I heard the announcement. She wants to keep it. What did you tell her? I told her to ask her mother because I'm not the one who's going to find it in the house in 3 days. Evelyn looked at him. He was watching the valley with the expression he wore when he was content, which was close to his neutral expression, but not quite. There was something fractionally less guarded in it, something that had been slowly releasing over the years of not needing to manage his exits. Tell her she can keep it outside, Evelyn said, in something with a lid. That's a reasonable position. I'm a reasonable person. He looked at her, the almost smile. You're a practical person. It's close, but not the same. My father's distinction, not mine, she said. Smart man, Cole said, the same thing he always said when her father came up. And she felt the same small warmth she always felt when he said it, because Cole Bennett did not say things he didn't mean and never had. She looked at the valley one more time. Martha's voice had stopped, which meant she'd either lost interest in the toad or was now engaged with it in a way that didn't require announcement. She thought about what she would tell Martha someday, not the dramatic version, not the story shaped for effect, but the actual truth of it, the way an honest accountant tells it. Full ledger, all columns. That the worst day of her life had also been the first day of this one. That trust is not a feeling that arrives before the evidence. It's a decision you make on incomplete information and then either prove right or wrong through the living of it. That the people worth knowing are usually the ones who don't make it easy to know them, not because they're hiding something worth hiding from you, but because they've learned the hard way that most people don't stay for the complicated parts. That staying for the complicated parts is, in the end, the only definition of love that holds up under actual conditions. That a man can be worth knowing even when you don't know him yet. That yet is one of the most important words in the language. Come on, Cole said. Harlan wants to go over the fall numbers before lunch. The fall numbers are fine, she said. I've been over them twice. He wants to go over them anyway. Because he's worried about the north pasture yield. Because he's 66 years old and going over the numbers makes him feel useful. And he is useful, so let him go over the numbers. She looked at Cole. He looked back. That's fair, she said. They turned the horses down off the ridge and rode into the valley together, the crosswind coming up around them as they descended, the mountains above holding the snow that would come again in a few months, and the light doing what the September light did in Wyoming on mornings like this, giving everything it had, knowing the season was turning, not holding back because the end was coming. Evelyn Mercer Bennett rode into the yard of the Crosswind Ranch and dismounted and handed Cora to the hand who came to take her and looked up at the mountains one more time before she went inside. She didn't need to know how the story ended to know it was the right one. She was living it. That was enough.